Chapter 61. Let moralists and philosophers say what they may, it is very questionable whether a guilty man would have felt half as much misery that night as Kit did, being innocent. The world, being in the constant commission of vast quantities of injustice, is a little too apt to comfort itself with the idea that if the victim of its falsehood and malice have a clear conscience, he cannot fail to be sustained under his trials, and somehow or other to come right at last. In which case, say they who have hunted him down, though we certainly don't expect it, nobody will be better pleased than we. Whereas, the world would do well to reflect that injustice is in itself, to every generous and properly constituted mind, an injury, of all others the most insufferable, the most torturing, and the most hard to bear. And that many clear consciences have gone to their account elsewhere, and many sound hearts have broken, because of this very reason. The knowledge of their own deserts only aggravating their sufferings, and rendering them the less endurable. The world, however, was not in fault in Kit's case. But Kit was innocent, and knowing this and feeling that his best friends deemed him guilty, that Mr. and Mrs. Garland would look upon him as a monster of ingratitude, that Barbara would associate him with all that was bad and criminal, that the pony would consider himself forsaken, and that even his own mother might perhaps yield to the strong appearances against him and believe him to be the wretch he seemed. Knowing and feeling all this, he experienced, at first, an agony of mind which no words can describe, and walked up and down the little cell in which he was locked up for the night, almost beside himself with grief. Even when the violence of these emotions had in some degree subsided, and he was beginning to grow more calm, there came into his mind a new thought, the anguish of which was scarcely less. The child, the bright star of the simple fellow's life, she, who always came back upon him like a beautiful dream, who had made the poorest part of his existence the happiest and best, who had ever been so gentle and considerate and good. If she were ever to hear of this, what would she think? As this idea occurred to him, the walls of the prison seemed to melt away, and the old place to reveal itself in their stead, as it was wont to be on winter nights. The fireside, the little supper table, the old man's hat and coat and stick, the half-open door leading to her little room, they were all there. And Nell herself was there, and he, both laughing heartily as they had often done. And when he had got as far as this, Kit could go no farther, but flung himself upon his poor bedstead and wept. It was a long night, which seemed as though it would have no end. But he slept too and dreamed, always of being at liberty and roving about, now with one person and now with another, but ever with a vague dread of being recalled to prison. Not that prison, but one which was in itself a dim idea, not of a place, but of a care and sorrow, of something oppressive and always present, and yet impossible to define. At last, the morning dawned, and there was the jail itself, cold, black, and dreary, and very real indeed. He was left to himself, however, and there was comfort in that. He had liberty to walk in a small paved yard at a certain hour, and learnt from the turnkey, who came to unlock his cell and show him where to wash, that there was a regular time for visiting, every day, and that if any of his friends came to see him, he would be fetched down to the grate. When he had given him this information, and a tin porringer containing his breakfast, the man locked him up again, and went clattering along the stone passage, opening and shutting a great many other doors, and raising numberless loud echoes which resounded through the building for a long time, as if they were in prison too, and unable to get out. This turnkey had given him to understand that he was lodged, like some few others in the jail, apart from the mass of prisoners, because he was not supposed to be utterly depraved and irreclaimable, and had never occupied apartments in that mansion before. Kit was thankful for this indulgence, and sat reading the church catechism very attentively, though he had known it by heart from a little child, until he heard the key in the lock, and the man entered again. "Now then," he said, "come on." "Where to, sir?" asked Kit. The man contented himself by briefly replying visitors, and taking him by the arm in exactly the same manner as the constable had done the day before, led him, through several winding ways and strong gates, into a passage, where he placed him at a grating and turned upon his heel. Beyond this grating, at the distance of about 4 or 5 feet, was another exactly like it. In the space between, sat a turnkey reading a newspaper, and outside the further railing, Kit saw, with a palpitating heart, his mother with the baby in her arms, Barbara's mother with her never-failing umbrella, and poor little Jacob, staring in with all his might, as though he were looking for the bird, or the wild beast, and thought the men were mere accidents with whom the bars could have no possible concern. But when little Jacob saw his brother, and, thrusting his arms between the rails to hug him, found that he came no nearer, but still stood afar off with his head resting on the arm by which he held to one of the bars, he began to cry most piteously. Whereupon, Kit's mother and Barbara's mother, who had restrained themselves as much as possible, burst out sobbing and weeping afresh. Poor Kit could not help joining them, and not one of them could speak a word. During this melancholy pause, the turnkey read his newspaper with a waggish look he had evidently got among the facetious paragraphs, until, happening to take his eyes off for an instant, as if to get by dint of contemplation at the very marrow of some joke of a deeper sort than the rest, it appeared to occur to him, for the first time, that somebody was crying. "Now, ladies," he said, looking round with surprise, "I'd advise you not to waste time like this. It's allowanced here, you know. You mustn't let that child make that noise either. It's against all rules." "I'm his poor mother, sir," sobbed Mrs. Nubbles, curtsying humbly. "And this is his brother, sir." "Oh, dear me, dear me." "Well," replied the turnkey, folding his paper on his knee, so as to get with greater convenience at the top of the next column, "it can't be helped, you know. He ain't the only one in the same fix. You mustn't make a noise about it." With that he went on reading. The man was not unnaturally cruel or hard-hearted. He had come to look upon felony as a kind of disorder, like the scarlet fever or erysipelas. Some people had it, some hadn't, just as it might be. "Oh, my darling Kit," said his mother, whom Barbara's mother had charitably relieved of the baby, "that I should see my poor boy here. You don't believe that I did what they accuse me of, mother dear?" cried Kit, in a choking voice. "I believe it," exclaimed the poor woman, "I that never knew you tell a lie, or do a bad action from your cradle, that have never had a moment's sorrow on your account, except it was the poor meals that you have taken with such good humor and content, that I forgot how little there was, when I thought how kind and thoughtful you were, though you were but a child. I believe it of the son that's been a comfort to me from the hour of his birth until this time, and that I never laid down one night in anger with. I believe it of you, Kit." "Why then, thank God," said Kit, clutching the bars with an earnestness that shook them, "and I can bear it, mother, come what may. I shall always have one drop of happiness in my heart when I think that you said that." At this the poor woman fell a-crying again, and Barbara's mother too, and little Jacob, whose disjointed thoughts had by this time resolved themselves into a pretty distinct impression that Kit couldn't go out for a walk if he wanted, and that there were no birds, lions, tigers, or other natural curiosities behind those bars, nothing indeed, but a caged brother, added his tears to theirs with as little noise as possible. Kit's mother, drying her eyes and moistening them, poor soul, more than she dried them, now took from the ground a small basket and submissively addressed herself to the turnkey, saying, would he please to listen to her for a minute? The turnkey, being in the very crisis and passion of a joke, motioned to her with his hand to keep silent 1 minute longer, for her life. Nor did he remove his hand into its former posture, but kept it in the same warning attitude until he had finished the paragraph, when he paused for a few seconds, with a smile upon his face, as who should say, this editor is a comical blade, a funny dog, and then asked her what she wanted. I have brought him a little something to eat, said the good woman. If you please, sir, might he have it? Yes, he may have it. There's no rule against that. Give it to me when you go, and I'll take care he has it. No, but if you please, sir, "Don't be angry with me, sir. I am his mother, and you had a mother once. If I might only see him eat a little bit, I should go away, so much more satisfied that he was all comfortable." And again the tears of Kit's mother burst forth, and of Barbara's mother, and of little Jacob. As to the baby, it was crowing and laughing with its might, under the idea, apparently, that the whole scene had been invented and got up for its particular satisfaction. The turnkey looked as if he thought the request a strange one and rather out of the common way, but nevertheless he laid down his paper, and coming round where Kit's mother stood, took the basket from her, and after inspecting its contents, handed it to Kit, and went back to his place. It may be easily conceived that the prisoner had no great appetite, but he sat down on the ground, and ate as hard as he could, while, at every morsel he put into his mouth, his mother sobbed and wept afresh, though with a softened grief that bespoke the satisfaction the sight afforded her. While he was thus engaged, Kit made some anxious inquiries about his employers, and whether they had expressed any opinion concerning him, but all he could learn was that Mr. Abel had himself broken the intelligence to his mother, with great kindness and delicacy, late on the previous night, but had himself expressed no opinion of his innocence or guilt. Kit was on the point of mustering courage to ask Barbara's mother about Barbara, when the turnkey who had conducted him reappeared. A second turnkey appeared behind his visitors, and the third turnkey with the newspaper cried, "Time's up," adding in the same breath, "Now for the next party," and then plunging deep into his newspaper again. Kit was taken off in an instant, with a blessing from his mother, and a scream from little Jacob, ringing in his ears. As he was crossing the next yard with the basket in his hand, under the guidance of his former conductor, another officer called to them to stop, and came up with a pint pot of porter in his hand. "This is Christopher Nubbles, isn't it, that come in last night for felony?" said the man. His comrade replied that this was the chicken in question. "Then here's your beer," said the other man to Christopher. "What are you looking at? There ain't a discharge in it." "I beg your pardon," said Kit. "Who sent it me?" "Why, your friend," replied the man. "You're to have it every day, he says. And so you will, if he pays for it." "My friend," repeated Kit. "You're all abroad, seemingly," returned the other man. "There's his letter. Take hold." Kit took it, and when he was locked up again, read as follows: "Drink of this cup. You'll find there's a spell in its every drop 'gainst the ills of mortality. Talk of the cordial that sparkled for Helen. Her cup was a fiction, but this is reality. Barclay and Company S. If they ever send it in a flat state, complain to the governor. Yours, R.S." "R.S.," said Kit, after some consideration. "It must be Mr. Richard Swiveller. Well, it's very kind of him, and I thank him heartily." Chapter 62. Offent light, twinkling from the window of the counting-house on Quilp's Wharf, and looking inflamed and red through the night fog, as though it suffered from it like an eye, forewarned Mr. Sampson Brass, as he approached the wooden cabin with a cautious step, that the excellent proprietor, his esteemed client, was inside, and probably waiting with his accustomed patience and sweetness of temper the fulfillment of the appointment which now brought Mr. Brass within his fair domain. "A treacherous place to pick one's steps in, of a dark night," muttered Sampson, as he stumbled for the 20th time over some stray lumber and limped in pain. "I believe that boy strews the ground differently every day, on purpose to bruise and maim one, unless his master does it with his own hands, which is more than likely. I hate to come to this place without Sally. She's more protection than a dozen men." As he paid this compliment to the merit of the absent charmer, Mr. Brass came to a halt, looking doubtfully towards the light and over his shoulder. "What's he about, I wonder?" murmured the lawyer, standing on tiptoe and endeavoring to obtain a glimpse of what was passing inside, which at that distance was impossible. "Drinking, I suppose, making himself more fiery and furious, and heating his malice and mischievousness till they boil. I'm always afraid to come here by myself, when his account's a pretty large one. I don't believe he'd mind throttling me and dropping me softly into the river when the tide was at its strongest. any more than he'd mind killing a rat. Indeed, I don't know whether he wouldn't consider it a pleasant joke. Hark! Now he's singing. Mr. Quilp was certainly entertaining himself with vocal exercise, but it was rather a kind of chant than a song, being a monotonous repetition of one sentence in a very rapid manner, with a long stress upon the last word, which he swelled into a dismal roar. Nor did the burden of this performance bear any reference to love, or war, or wine, or loyalty, or any other, the standard topics of song, but to a subject not often set to music or generally known in ballads, the words being these. The worthy magistrate, after remarking that the prisoner would find some difficulty in persuading a jury to believe his tale, committed him to take his trial at the approaching sessions, and directed the customary recognizances to be entered into for the prose tie-in. Every time he came to this concluding word, and had exhausted all possible stress upon it, Quilp burst into a shriek of laughter and began again. "He's dreadfully imprudent," muttered Brass, after he had listened to 2 or 3 repetitions of the chant. "Horribly imprudent. I wish he was dumb. I wish he was deaf. I wish he was blind." "Hang him," cried Brass, as the chant began again. "I wish he was dead." Giving utterance to these friendly aspirations in behalf of his client, Mr. Sampson composed his face into its usual state of smoothness, and waiting until the shriek came again and was dying away, went up to the wooden house and knocked at the door. "Come in," cried the dwarf. "How do you do tonight, sir?" said Sampson, peeping in. "Ha ha! How do you do, sir? Oh dear me, how very whimsical! Amazingly whimsical, to be sure." "Come in, you fool," returned the dwarf, "and don't stand there shaking your head and showing your teeth. Come in, you false witness, you perjurer, you suborner of evidence, come in." "He has the richest humor," cried Brass, shutting the door behind him. "The most amazing vein of comicality. But isn't it rather injudicious, sir?" "What?" demanded Quilp. "What Judas?" "Judas," cried Brass. "He has such extraordinary spirits. His humor is so extremely playful. Judas. Oh yes. Dear me, how very good. Ha ha ha." All this time, Sampson was rubbing his hands and staring, with ludicrous surprise and dismay, at a great, goggle-eyed, blunt-nosed figurehead of some old ship, which was reared up against the wall in a corner near the stove, looking like a goblin or hideous idol whom the dwarf worshipped. A mass of timber on its head, carved into the dim and distant semblance of a cocked hat, together with a representation of a star on the left breast and epaulets on the shoulders, denoted that it was intended for the effigy of some famous admiral. But, without those helps, any observer might have supposed it the authentic portrait of a distinguished merman or great sea monster. Being originally much too large for the apartment which it was now employed to decorate, it had been sawn short off at the waist. Even in this state it reached from floor to ceiling, and thrusting itself forward, with that excessively wide-awake aspect and air of somewhat obtrusive politeness by which figureheads are usually characterized, seemed to reduce everything else to mere pygmy proportions. "Do you know it?" said the dwarf, watching Sampson's eyes. "Do you see the likeness?" "Eh?" said Brass, holding his head on one side and throwing it a little back, as connoisseurs do. "Now I look at it again, I fancy I see yes, there certainly is something in the smile that reminds me of, and yet upon my word I—" Now, the fact was that Sampson, having never seen anything in the smallest degree resembling this substantial phantom, was much perplexed, being uncertain whether Mr. Quilp considered it like himself, and had therefore bought it for a family portrait, or whether he was pleased to consider it as the likeness of some enemy. He was not very long in doubt, for, while he was surveying it with that knowing look which people assume when they are contemplating for the first time portraits which they ought to recognize but don't, the dwarf threw down the newspaper from which he had been chanting the words already quoted, and seizing a rusty iron bar, which he used in lieu of poker, dealt the figure such a stroke on the nose that it rocked again. "Is it like Kit? Is it his picture, his image, his very self?" cried the dwarf, aiming a shower of blows at the insensible countenance and covering it with deep dimples. "Is it the exact model and counterpart of the dog? Is it? Is it? Is it?" And with every repetition of the question, he battered the great image until the perspiration streamed down his face with the violence of the exercise. Although this might have been a very comical thing to look at from a secure gallery, as a bullfight is found to be a comfortable spectacle by those who are not in the arena, and a house on fire is better than a play to people who don't live near it, there was something in the earnestness of Mr. Quilp's manner which made his legal adviser feel that the counting-house was a little too small and a deal too lonely for the complete enjoyment of these humors. Therefore, he stood as far off as he could, while the dwarf was thus engaged, whimpering out but feeble applause, and when Quilp left off and sat down again from pure exhaustion, approached with more obsequiousness than ever. "Excellent indeed," cried Brass. "He. Oh, very good, sir." "You know," said Samson, looking round as if in appeal to the bruised animal, "he's quite a remarkable man, quite." "Sit down," said the dwarf. "I bought the dog yesterday. I've been screwing gimlets into him and sticking forks in his eyes and cutting my name on him. I mean to burn him at last." "Ha ha," cried Brass. "Extremely entertaining indeed." "Come here," said Quilp, beckoning him to draw near. "What's injudicious, hey?" "Nothing, sir, nothing. Scarcely worth mentioning, sir. But I thought that song, admirably humorous in itself, you know, was perhaps rather—" "Yes," said Quilp, "rather what?" "Just bordering, or as one may say remotely verging, upon the confines of injudiciousness, perhaps, sir," returned Brass, looking timidly at the dwarf's cunning eyes, which were turned towards the fire and reflected its red light. "Why?" inquired Quilp, without looking up. "Why, you know, sir," returned Brass, venturing to be more familiar. "The fact is, sir, that any allusion to these little combinings together of friends for objects in themselves extremely laudable, but which the law terms conspiracies, are, you take me, sir, best kept snug and among friends, you know." "Eh," said Quilp, looking up with a perfectly vacant countenance. "What do you mean?" "Cautious, exceedingly cautious, very right and proper," cried Brass, nodding his head. "Mum, sir, even here, my meaning, sir, exactly." "Your meaning exactly, you brazen scarecrow? What's your meaning?" retorted Quilp. "Why do you talk to me of combining together? Do I combine? Do I know anything about your combinings?" "No, no, sir, certainly not. Not by any means," returned Brass. "If you so wink and nod at me," said the dwarf, looking about him as if for his poker, "I'll spoil the expression of your monkey's face, I will." "Don't put yourself out of the way, I beg, sir," rejoined Brass, checking himself with great alacrity. "You're quite right, sir, quite right. I shouldn't have mentioned the subject, sir. It's much better not to. You're quite right, sir. Let us change it, if you please. You were asking, sir, Sally told me, about our lodger. He has not returned, sir." "No?" said Quilp, heating some rum in a little saucepan, and watching it to prevent its boiling over. "Why not?" "Why, sir," returned Brass, "dear me, Mr. Quilp, sir." "What's the matter?" said the dwarf, stopping his hand in the act of carrying the saucepan to his mouth. "You have forgotten the water, sir," said Brass. "And, excuse me, sir, but it's burning hot." Deigning no other than a practical answer to this remonstrance, Mr. Quilp raised the hot saucepan to his lips and deliberately drank off all the spirit it contained, which might have been in quantity about half a pint, and had been but a moment before, when he took it off the fire, bubbling and hissing fiercely. Having swallowed this gentle stimulant and shaken his fist at the Admiral, he bade Mr. Brass proceed. "But first," said Quilp with his accustomed grin, "have a drop yourself. A nice drop, a good, warm, fiery drop." "Why, sir," replied Brass, "if there was such a thing as a mouthful of water that could be got without trouble, "There's no such thing to be had here," cried the dwarf. "Water for lawyers. Melted lead and brimstone. You mean nice hot blistering pitch and tar. That's the thing for them, eh, Brass, eh?" "Ha ha ha," laughed Mr. Brass. "Oh, very biting. And yet it's like being tickled. There's a pleasure in it too, sir." "Drink that," said the dwarf, who had by this time heated some more. "Toss it off. Don't leave any heel tap. Scorch your throat and be happy." The wretched Samson took a few short sips of the liquor, which immediately distilled itself into burning tears, and in that form came rolling down his cheeks into the pipkin again, turning the color of his face and eyelids to a deep red, and giving rise to a violent fit of coughing, in the midst of which he was still heard to declare, with the constancy of a martyr, that it was beautiful indeed. While he was yet in unspeakable agonies, the dwarf renewed their conversation. "The lodger," said Quilp, "what about him?" "He is still, sir," returned Brass, with intervals of coughing, "stopping with the Garland family. He has only been home once, sir, since the day of the examination of that culprit. He informed Mr. Richard, sir, that he couldn't bear the house after what had taken place, that he was wretched in it, and that he looked upon himself as being in a certain kind of way the cause of the occurrence. A very excellent lodger, sir. I hope we may not lose him." "Yah!" cried the dwarf, "never thinking of anybody but yourself. Why don't you retrench then? Scrape up, hoard, economize, eh?" "Why, sir," replied Brass, "upon my word I think Sarah's as good an economizer as any going. I do indeed, Mr. Quilp. Moisten your clay. Wet the other eye. Drink, man," cried the dwarf. "You took a clerk to oblige me." "Delighted, sir, I am sure, at any time," replied Samson. "Yes, sir, I did." "Then now you may discharge him," said Quilp. "There's a means of retrenchment for you at once." "Discharge Mr. Richard, sir," cried Brass. "Have you more than one clerk, you parrot, that you ask the question?" "Yes." "Upon my word, sir," said Brass, "I wasn't prepared for this." "How could you be?" sneered the dwarf, "when I wasn't? How often am I to tell you that I brought him to you that I might always have my eye on him and know where he was, and that I had a plot, a scheme, a little quiet piece of enjoyment afoot, of which the very cream and essence was, that this old man and grandchild, who have sunk underground, I think, should be, while he and his precious friend believe them rich, in reality as poor as frozen rats." "I quite understood that, sir," rejoined Brass. "Thoroughly." "Well, sir," retorted Quilp, "and do you understand now that they're not poor, that they can't be, if they have such men as your lodger searching for them and scouring the country far and wide?" "Of course I do, sir," said Samson. "Of course you do," retorted the dwarf, viciously snapping at his words. "Of course do you understand, then, that it's no matter what comes of this fellow? Of course do you understand that for any other purpose he's no man for me, nor for you?" "I have frequently said to Sarah, sir," returned Brass, "that he was of no use at all in the business. You can't put any confidence in him, sir. If you'll believe me, I've found that fellow, in the commonest little matters of the office that have been trusted to him, blurting out the truth, though expressly cautioned. The aggravation of that chap, sir, has exceeded anything you can imagine. It has indeed. Nothing but the respect and obligation I owe to you, sir." As it was plain that Samson was bent on a complimentary harangue, unless he received a timely interruption, Mr. Quilp politely tapped him on the crown of his head with the little saucepan, and requested that he would be so obliging as to hold his peace. "Practical, sir, practical," said Brass, rubbing the place and smiling, "but still extremely pleasant, immensely so." "Hearken to me, will you?" returned Quilp, "or I'll be a little more pleasant presently. There's no chance of his comrade and friend returning. The scamp has been obliged to fly, as I learn, for some knavery, and has found his way abroad. Let him rot there." "Certainly, sir. Quite proper. Forcible," cried Brass, glancing at the Admiral again, as if he made a third in company. extremely forcible. I hate him, said Quilp between his teeth, and have always hated him, for family reasons. Besides, he was an intractable ruffian. Otherwise, he would have been of use. This fellow is pigeon-hearted and light-headed. I don't want him any longer. Let him hang or drown. Starve. Go to the devil. By all means, sir, returned Brass. When would you wish him, sir, to to make that little excursion? When this trial's over, said Quilp. As soon as that's ended, send him about his business. It shall be done, sir, returned Brass. By all means. It will be rather a blow to Sarah, sir, but she has all her feelings under control. Ah, Mr. Quilp, I often think, sir, if it had only pleased Providence to bring you and Sarah together in earlier life, what blessed results would have flowed from such a union. You never saw our dear father, sir? A charming gentleman. Sarah was his pride and joy, sir. He would have closed his eyes in bliss, would Foxy, Mr. Quilp, if he could have found her such a partner. You esteem her, sir? I love her, croaked the dwarf. You're very good, sir, returned Brass, I am sure. Is there any other order, sir, that I can take a note of, besides this little matter of Mr. Richard? None, replied the dwarf, seizing the saucepan. Let us drink the lovely Sarah. If we could do it in something, sir, that wasn't quite boiling, suggested Brass humbly, perhaps it would be better. I think it will be more agreeable to Sarah's feelings when she comes to hear from me of the honor you have done her, if she learns it was in liquor rather cooler than the last, sir. But to these remonstrances, Mr. Quilp turned a deaf ear. Samson Brass, who was, by this time, anything but sober, being compelled to take further draughts of the same strong bowl, found that, instead of at all contributing to his recovery, they had the novel effect of making the counting-house spin round and round with extreme velocity, and causing the floor and ceiling to heave in a very distressing manner. After a brief stupor, he awoke to a consciousness of being partly under the table and partly under the grate. This position not being the most comfortable one he could have chosen for himself, he managed to stagger to his feet, and, holding on by the Admiral, looked round for his host. Mr. Brass's first impression was that his host was gone and had left him there alone, perhaps locked him in for the night. A strong smell of tobacco, however, suggested a new train of ideas. He looked upward and saw that the dwarf was smoking in his hammock. "Goodbye, sir," cried Brass faintly. "Goodbye, sir." "Won't you stop all night?" said the dwarf, peeping out. "Do stop all night." "I couldn't indeed, sir," replied Brass, who was almost dead from nausea and the closeness of the room. "If you'd have the goodness to show me a light, so that I may see my way across the yard, sir." Quilp was out in an instant, not with his legs first, or his head first, or his arms first, but bodily, altogether. "To be sure," he said, taking up a lantern, which was now the only light in the place. "Be careful how you go, my dear friend. Be sure to pick your way among the timber, for all the rusty nails are upwards. There's a dog in the lane. He bit a man last night, and a woman the night before, and last Tuesday he killed a child, but that was in play. Don't go too near him." "Which side of the road is he, sir?" asked Brass in great dismay. "He lives on the right hand," said Quilp, "but sometimes he hides on the left, ready for a spring. He's uncertain in that respect. Mind you take care of yourself. I'll never forgive you if you don't. There's the light out, never mind. You know the way, straight on." Quilp had slyly shaded the light by holding it against his breast, and now stood chuckling and shaking from head to foot in a rapture of delight, as he heard the lawyers stumbling up the yard, and now and then falling heavily down. At length, however, he got quit of the place, and was out of hearing. The dwarf shut himself up again, and sprang once more into his hammock. Chapter 63. The professional gentleman who had given Kit the consolatory piece of information relative to the settlement of his trifle of business at the Old Bailey, and the probability of its being very soon disposed of, turned out to be quite correct in his prognostications. In 8 days' time, the sessions commenced. In one day afterwards, the grand jury found a true bill against Christopher Nubbles for felony, and in 2 days from that finding, the aforesaid Christopher Nubbles was called upon to plead guilty or not guilty to an indictment for that he the said Christopher did feloniously abstract and steal from the dwelling house and office of one Sampson Brass, gentleman, one bank note for £5 issued by the Governor and Company of the Bank of England, in contravention of the statutes in that case, made and provided, and against the peace of our sovereign Lord the King, his crown and dignity. To this indictment, Christopher Nubbles, in a low and trembling voice, pleaded not guilty. And here, let those who are in the habit of forming hasty judgments from appearances, and who would have had Christopher, if innocent, speak out very strong and loud, observe that confinement and anxiety will subdue the stoutest hearts, and that to one who has been close shut up, though it be only for 10 or 11 days, seeing but stone walls and a very few stony faces, the sudden entrance into a great hall filled with life is a rather disconcerting and startling circumstance. To this, it must be added, that life in a wig is to a large class of people much more terrifying and impressive than life with its own head of hair. And if, in addition to these considerations, there be taken into account Kit's natural emotion on seeing the two Mr. Garlands and the little notary looking on with pale and anxious faces, it will perhaps seem matter of no very great wonder that he should have been rather out of sorts and unable to make himself quite at home. Although he had never seen either of the Mr. Garlands or Mr. Witherden since the time of his arrest, he had been given to understand that they had employed counsel for him. Therefore, when one of the gentlemen in wigs got up and said, "I am for the prisoner, my lord," Kit made him a bow. And when another gentleman in a wig got up and said, "And I'm against him, my lord," Kit trembled very much and bowed to him too. And didn't he hope in his own heart that his gentleman was a match for the other gentleman, and would make him ashamed of himself in no time? The gentleman who was against him had to speak first, and being in dreadfully good spirits, for he had, in the last trial, very nearly procured the acquittal of a young gentleman who had had the misfortune to murder his father, he spoke up, you may be sure, telling the jury that if they acquitted this prisoner they must expect to suffer no less pangs and agonies than he had told the other jury they would certainly undergo if they convicted that prisoner. And when he had told them all about the case, and that he had never known a worse case, he stopped a little while, like a man who had something terrible to tell them, and then said that he understood an attempt would be made by his learned friend, and here he looked sideways at Kit's gentleman, to impeach the testimony of those immaculate witnesses whom he should call before them. But he did hope and trust that his learned friend would have a greater respect and veneration for the character of the prosecutor, than whom, as he well knew, there did not exist, and never had existed, a more honorable member of that most honorable profession to which he was attached. And then he said, did the jury know Bevis Marks? And if they did know Bevis Marks, as he trusted for their own character, did they know the historical and elevating associations connected with that most remarkable spot? Did they believe that a man like Brass could reside in a place like Bevis Marks, and not be a virtuous and most upright character? And when he had said a great deal to them on this point, he remembered that it was an insult to their understandings to make any remarks on what they must have felt so strongly without him, and therefore called Sampson Brass into the witness box straightway. Then up comes Mr. Brass, very brisk and fresh, and, having bowed to the judge, like a man who has had the pleasure of seeing him before, and who hopes he has been pretty well since their last meeting, folds his arms, and looks at his gentleman as much as to say, "Here I am, full of evidence, tap me." And the gentleman does tap him presently, and with great discretion too, drawing off the evidence by little and little, and making it run quite clear and bright in the eyes of all present. Then Kit's gentleman takes him in hand, but can make nothing of him, and after a great many very long questions and very short answers, Mr. Sampson Brass goes down in glory. To him succeeds Sarah, who in like manner is easy to be managed by Mr. Brass's gentleman, but very obdurate to Kit's. In short, Kit's gentleman can get nothing out of her but a repetition of what she has said before, only a little stronger this time, as against his client, and therefore lets her go, in some confusion. Then, Mr. Brass's gentleman calls Richard Swiveller, and Richard Swiveller appears accordingly. Now, Mr. Brass's gentleman has it whispered in his ear that this witness is disposed to be friendly to the prisoner, which, to say the truth, he is rather glad to hear, as his strength is considered to lie in what is familiarly termed badgering. Wherefore, he begins by requesting the officer to be quite sure that this witness kisses the book, then goes to work at him, tooth and nail. "Mr. Swiveller," says this gentleman to Dick, when he had told his tale with evident reluctance and a desire to make the best of it, "Pray, sir, where did you dine yesterday?" "Where did I dine yesterday?" "Aye, sir, where did you dine yesterday? Was it near here, sir?" "Oh, to be sure, yes, just over the way." "To be sure, yes, just over the way," repeats Mr. Brass's gentleman, with a glance at the court. "Alone, sir?" "I beg your pardon," says Mr. Swiveller, who has not caught the question. "Alone, sir?" repeats Mr. Brass's gentleman in a voice of thunder. "Did you dine alone? Did you treat anybody, sir? Come." "Oh, yes, to be sure. Yes, I did," says Mr. Swiveller with a smile. "Have the goodness to banish a levity, sir, which is very ill-suited to the place in which you stand, though perhaps you have reason to be thankful that it's only that place," says Mr. Brass's gentleman, with a nod of the head, insinuating that the dock is Mr. Swiveller's legitimate sphere of action. "And attend to me. You were waiting about here, yesterday, in expectation that this trial was coming on. You dined over the way. You treated somebody. Now, was that somebody brother to the prisoner at the bar?" Mr. Swiveller is proceeding to explain. "Yes or no, sir," cries Mr. Brass's gentleman. "But will you allow me, yes or no, sir?" "Yes, it was, but—" "Yes, it was," cries the gentleman, taking him up short. "And a very pretty witness you are." Down sits Mr. Brass's gentleman. Kit's gentleman, not knowing how the matter really stands, is afraid to pursue the subject. Richard Swiveller retires abashed. Judge, jury, and spectators have visions of his lounging about, with an ill-looking, large-whiskered, dissolute young fellow of 6 feet high. The reality is little Jacob, with the calves of his legs exposed to the open air, and himself tied up in a shawl. Nobody knows the truth. Everybody believes a falsehood, and all because of the ingenuity of Mr. Brass's gentleman. Then come the witnesses to character, and here Mr. Brass's gentleman shines again. It turns out that Mr. Garland has had no character with Kit, no recommendation of him but from his own mother, and that he was suddenly dismissed by his former master for unknown reasons. "Really, Mr. Garland," says Mr. Brass's gentleman, "for a person who has arrived at your time of life, you are, to say the least of it, singularly indiscreet, I think." The jury thinks so too, and find Kit guilty. He is taken off, humbly protesting his innocence. The spectators settle themselves in their places with renewed attention, for there are several female witnesses to be examined in the next case, and it has been rumored that Mr. Brass's gentleman will make great fun in cross-examining them for the prisoner. Kit's mother, poor woman, is waiting at the grate below stairs, accompanied by Barbara's mother, who, honest soul, never does anything but cry and hold the baby, and a sad interview ensues. The newspaper-reading turnkey has told them all. He don't think it will be transportation for life, because there's time to prove the good character yet, and that is sure to serve him. He wonders what he did it for. "He never did it," cries Kit's mother. "Well," says the turnkey, "I won't contradict you. It's all one, now, whether he did it or not." Kit's mother can reach his hand through the bars, and she clasps it. God, and those to whom he has given such tenderness, only know in how much agony. Kit bids her keep a good heart, and under pretense of having the children lifted up to kiss him, prays Barbara's mother in a whisper to take her home. "Some friend will rise up for us, mother," cried Kit, "I am sure. If not now, before long. My innocence will come out, mother, and I shall be brought back again. I feel confidence in that. You must teach little Jacob and the baby how all this was, for if they thought I had ever been dishonest, when they grew old enough to understand, It would break my heart to know it, if I was thousands of miles away. Oh, is there no good gentleman here, who will take care of her? The hand slips out of his, for the poor creature sinks down upon the earth, insensible. Richard Swiveller comes hastily up, elbows the bystanders out of the way, takes her, after some trouble, in one arm after the manner of theatrical ravishers, and, nodding to Kit and commanding Barbara's mother to follow, for he has a coach waiting, bears her swiftly off. Well, Richard took her home. And what astonishing absurdities in the way of quotation from song and poem he perpetrated on the road. No man knows. He took her home and stayed till she was recovered. And, having no money to pay the coach, went back in state to Bevis Marks, bidding the driver, for it was Saturday night, wait at the door while he went in for change. "Mr. Richard, sir," said Brass cheerfully. "Good evening." Monstrous as Kit's tale had appeared, at first, Mr. Richard did, that night, half suspect his affable employer of some deep villainy. Perhaps it was but the misery he had just witnessed which gave his careless nature this impulse. But, be that as it may, it was very strong upon him, and he said in as few words as possible what he wanted. "Money!" cried Brass, taking out his purse. "Ha ha! To be sure, Mr. Richard, to be sure, sir. All men must live. You haven't change for a £5 note, have you, sir?" "No," returned Dick, shortly. "Oh," said Brass, "here's the very sum. That saves trouble. You're very welcome, I'm sure, Mr. Richard, sir." Dick, who had by this time reached the door, turned round. "You needn't," said Brass, "trouble yourself to come back any more, sir." You see, Mr. Richard," said Brass, thrusting his hands in his pockets and rocking himself to and fro on his stool, "the fact is that a man of your abilities is lost, sir, quite lost, in our dry and moldy line. It's terrible drudgery, shocking, I should say, now, that the stage, or the army, Mr. Richard, or something very superior in the licensed victualling way, was the kind of thing that would call out the genius of such a man as you. I hope you'll look in to see us now and then. Sally, sir, will be delighted, I'm sure. She's extremely sorry to lose you, Mr. Richard, but a sense of her duty to society reconciles her. An amazing creature that, sir. You'll find the money quite correct, I think. There's a cracked window, sir, but I've not made any deduction on that account. Whenever we part with friends, Mr. Richard, let us part liberally. A delightful sentiment, sir." To all these rambling observations, Mr. Swiveller answered not one word, but, returning for the aquatic jacket, rolled it into a tight round ball, looking steadily at Brass meanwhile as if he had some intention of bowling him down with it. He only took it under his arm, however, and marched out of the office in profound silence. When he had closed the door, he reopened it, stared in again for a few moments with the same portentous gravity, and nodding his head once, in a slow and ghost-like manner, vanished. He paid the coachman, and turned his back on Bevis Marks, big with great designs for the comforting of Kit's mother and the aid of Kit himself. But the lives of gentlemen devoted to such pleasures as Richard Swiveller are extremely precarious. The spiritual excitement of the last fortnight, working upon a system affected in no slight degree by the spirituous excitement of some years, proved a little too much for him. That very night, Mr. Richard was seized with an alarming illness, and in 24 hours was stricken with a raging fever. Chapter 64. Tossing to and fro upon his hot, uneasy bed, tormented by a fierce thirst which nothing could appease, unable to find, in any change of posture, a moment's peace or ease, and rambling ever through deserts of thought where there was no resting place, no sight or sound suggestive of refreshment or repose, nothing but a dull eternal weariness, with no change but the restless shiftings of his miserable body and the weary wandering of his mind, constant still to one ever-present anxiety, to a sense of something left undone, of some fearful obstacle to be surmounted, of some carking care that would not be driven away, and which haunted the distempered brain, now in this form, now and that, always shadowy and dim, but recognizable for the same phantom in every shape it took, darkening every vision like an evil conscience and making slumber horrible. In these slow tortures of his dread disease, the unfortunate Richard lay wasting and consuming inch by inch, until, at last, when he seemed to fight and struggle to rise up, and to be held down by devils, he sank into a deep sleep and dreamed no more. He awoke, with a sensation of most blissful rest, better than sleep itself. He began gradually to remember something of these sufferings, and to think what a long night it had been, and whether he had not been delirious twice or thrice. Happening, in the midst of these cogitations, to raise his hand, he was astonished to find how heavy it seemed, and yet how thin and light it really was. Still, he felt indifferent and happy, and having no curiosity to pursue the subject, remained in the same waking slumber until his attention was attracted by a cough. This made him doubt whether he had locked his door last night, and feel a little surprised at having a companion in the room. Still, he lacked energy to follow up this train of thought, and unconsciously fell, in a luxury of repose, to staring at some green stripes on the bed furniture, and associating them strangely with patches of fresh turf, while the yellow ground between made gravel walks, and so helped out a long perspective of trim gardens. He was rambling in imagination on these terraces, and had quite lost himself among them indeed, when he heard the cough once more. The walks shrunk into stripes again at the sound, and raising himself a little in the bed, and holding the curtain open with one hand, he looked out. The same room certainly, and still by candlelight. But with what unbounded astonishment did he see all those bottles and basins and articles of linen airing by the fire, and such like furniture of a sick chamber, all very clean and neat, but all quite different from anything he had left there when he went to bed. The atmosphere, too, filled with the cool smell of herbs and vinegar. The floor newly sprinkled. The what? The Marchioness? Yes, playing cribbage with herself at the table. There she sat, intent upon her game, coughing now and then in a subdued manner as if she feared to disturb him, shuffling the cards, cutting, dealing, playing, counting, pegging, going through all the mysteries of cribbage as if she had been in full practice from her cradle. Mr. Swiveller contemplated these things for a short time, and suffering the curtain to fall into its former position, laid his head on the pillow again. "I'm dreaming," thought Richard. "That's clear. When I went to bed, my hands were not made of eggshells, and now I can almost see through 'em. If this is not a dream, I have woke up, by mistake, in an Arabian night instead of a London one. But I have no doubt I'm asleep. Not the least." Here the small servant had another cough. "Very remarkable," thought Mr. Swiveller. "I never dreamt such a real cough as that before. I don't know, indeed, that I ever dreamt either a cough or a sneeze. Perhaps it's part of the philosophy of dreams that one never does. There's another and another. I say, I'm dreaming rather fast." For the purpose of testing his real condition, Mr. Swiveller, after some reflection, pinched himself in the arm. "Queerer still," he thought. "I came to bed rather plump than otherwise, and now there's nothing to lay hold of. I'll take another survey." The result of this additional inspection was to convince Mr. Swiveller that the objects by which he was surrounded were real, and that he saw them, beyond all question, with his waking eyes. "It's an Arabian night, that's what it is," said Richard. "I'm in Damascus or Grand Cairo. The Marchioness is a genie, and having had a wager with another genie about who is the handsomest young man alive, and the worthiest to be the husband of the Princess of China, has brought me away, room and all, to compare us together. Perhaps," said Mr. Swiveller, turning languidly round on his pillow, and looking on that side of his bed which was next the wall, "the princess may be still. No, she's gone." Not feeling quite satisfied with this explanation, as, even taking it to be the correct one, it still involved a little mystery and doubt, Mr. Swiveller raised the curtain again, determined to take the first favorable opportunity of addressing his companion. An occasion presented itself. The Marchioness dealt, turned up a knave, and omitted to take the usual advantage. Upon which Mr. Swiveller called out as loud as he could, "Two for his heels." The Marchioness jumped up quickly and clapped her hands. Arabian Nights, certainly, thought Mr. Swiveller. They always clap their hands instead of ringing the bell. Now for the 2,000 black slaves, with jars of jewels on their heads. It appeared, however, that she had only clapped her hands for joy, for directly afterward she began to laugh, and then to cry, declaring, not in choice Arabic but in familiar English, that she was so glad she didn't know what to do. "Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, thoughtfully, "be pleased to draw nearer. First of all, will you have the goodness to inform me where I shall find my voice, and secondly, what has become of my flesh?" The Marchioness only shook her head mournfully and cried again. Whereupon Mr. Swiveller, being very weak, felt his own eyes affected likewise. "I begin to infer, from your manner and these appearances, Marchioness," said Richard after a pause, and smiling with a trembling lip, "that I have been ill." "You just have," replied the small servant, wiping her eyes. "And haven't you been a-talking nonsense?" "Oh," said Dick, "very ill, Marchioness, have I been?" "Dead, all but," replied the small servant. "I never thought you'd get better." "Thank heaven you have." Mr. Swiveller was silent for a long while. By and by, he began to talk again, inquiring how long he had been there. 3 weeks tomorrow," replied the servant. "3 what?" said Dick. "Weeks," returned the Marchioness emphatically. 3 long, slow weeks. The bare thought of having been in such extremity caused Richard to fall into another silence, and to lie flat down again at his full length. The Marchioness, having arranged the bedclothes more comfortably, and felt that his hands and forehead were quite cool, a discovery that filled her with delight, cried a little more, and then applied herself to getting tea ready and making some thin, dry toast. While she was thus engaged, Mr. Swiveller looked on with a grateful heart, very much astonished to see how thoroughly at home she made herself, and attributing this attention, in its origin, to Sally Brass, whom, in his own mind, he could not thank enough. When the Marchioness had finished her toasting, she spread a clean cloth on a tray, and brought him some crisp slices and a great basin of weak tea, with which, she said, the doctor had left word he might refresh himself when he awoke. She propped him up with pillows, if not as skillfully as if she had been a professional nurse all her life, at least as tenderly, and looked on with unutterable satisfaction while the patient, stopping every now and then to shake her by the hand, took his poor meal with an appetite and relish which the greatest dainties of the earth, under any other circumstances, would have failed to provoke. Having cleared away and disposed everything comfortably about him again, she sat down at the table to take her own tea. "Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, "how's Sally?" The small servant screwed her face into an expression of the very uttermost entanglement of slyness, and shook her head. "What, haven't you seen her lately?" said Dick. "Seen her?" cried the small servant. "Bless you, I've run away." Mr. Swiveller immediately laid himself down again quite flat, and so remained for about 5 minutes. By slow degrees he resumed his sitting posture after that lapse of time, and inquired, "And where do you live, Marchioness?" "Live!" cried the small servant. "Here." "Oh," said Mr. Swiveller, and with that he fell down flat again, as suddenly as if he had been shot. Thus he remained, motionless and bereft of speech, until she had finished her meal, put everything in its place, and swept the hearth, when he motioned her to bring a chair to the bedside, and, being propped up again, opened a farther conversation. "And so," said Dick, "you have run away?" "Yes," said the Marchioness, "and they've been a-tizing of me." "Been? I beg your pardon," said Dick. "What have they been doing?" "Been a-tizing of me, tizing, you know, in the newspapers," rejoined the Marchioness. I, said Dick. "Advertising?" The small servant nodded and winked. Her eyes were so red with waking and crying that the tragic muse might have winked with greater consistency. And so Dick felt. "Tell me," said he, "how it was that you thought of coming here." "Why, you see," returned the Marchioness, "when you was gone, I hadn't any friend at all, because the lodger he never come back, and I didn't know where either him or you was to be found, you know. But one morning, when I was near a keyhole," suggested Mr. Swiveller, observing that she faltered. "Well then," said the small servant, nodding, "when I was near the office keyhole, as you see me through, you know, I heard somebody saying that she lived here, and was the lady whose house you lodged at, and that you was took very bad, and wouldn't nobody come and take care of you. Mr. Brass, he says, it's no business of mine, he says, and Miss Sally, she says, he's a funny chap, but it's no business of mine. And the lady went away, and slammed the door to when she went out, I can't tell you. So I run away that night, and come here, and told him you was my brother, and they believed me, and I've been here ever since." "This poor little Marchioness has been wearing herself to death," cried Dick. "No, I haven't," she returned. "Not a bit of it. Don't you mind about me. I like sitting up, and I've often had a sleep, bless you, in one of them chairs. But if you could have seen how you tried to jump out a winder, and if you could have heard how you used to keep on singing and making speeches, you wouldn't have believed it. I'm so glad you're better, Mr. Liverer." "Liverer indeed," said Dick thoughtfully. "It's well I am a liverer. I strongly suspect I should have died, Marchioness, but for you." At this point, Mr. Swiveller took the small servant's hand in his again, and being, as we have seen, but poorly, might in struggling to express his thanks have made his eyes as red as hers, but that she quickly changed the theme by making him lie down, and urging him to keep very quiet. "The doctor," she told him, "said you was to be kept quite still, and there was to be no noise nor nothing. Now take a rest, and then we'll talk again. I'll sit by you, you know. If you shut your eyes, perhaps you'll go to sleep. You'll be all the better for it if you do." The Marchioness, in saying these words, brought a little table to the bedside, took her seat at it, and began to work away at the concoction of some cooling drink, with the address of a score of chemists. Richard Swiveller, being indeed fatigued, fell into a slumber, and waking in about half an hour, inquired what time it was. "Just gone half after 6, replied his small friend, helping him to sit up again. "Marchioness," said Richard, passing his hand over his forehead and turning suddenly round, as though the subject but that moment flashed upon him, "what has become of Kit?" "He had been sentenced to transportation for a great many years," she said. "Has he gone?" asked Dick. "His mother. How is she? What has become of her?" His nurse shook her head, and answered that she knew nothing about them. "But if I thought," said she, very slowly, "that you'd keep quiet, and not put yourself into another fever, I could tell you, but I won't now." "Yes, do," said Dick. "It will amuse me." "Oh, would it though?" rejoined the small servant, with a horrified look. "I know better than that. Wait till you're better, and then I'll tell you." Dick looked very earnestly at his little friend, and his eyes, being large and hollow from illness, assisted the expression so much that she was quite frightened, and besought him not to think any more about it. What had already fallen from her, however, had not only piqued his curiosity, but seriously alarmed him, wherefore he urged her to tell him the worst at once. "Oh, there's no worst in it," said the small servant. "It hasn't anything to do with you." "Has it anything to do with? Is it anything you heard through chinks or keyholes, and that you were not intended to hear?" asked Dick, in a breathless state. "Yes," replied the small servant. In Bevis Marks?" pursued Dick hastily. "Conversations between Brass and Sally?" "Yes," cried the small servant again. Richard Swiveller thrust his lank arm out of bed, and, gripping her by the wrist and drawing her close to him, bade her out with it, and freely too, or he would not answer for the consequences. Being wholly unable to endure the state of excitement and expectation, she, seeing that he was greatly agitated, and that the effects of postponing her revelation might be much more injurious than any that were likely to ensue from its being made at once, promised compliance, on condition that the patient kept himself perfectly quiet and abstained from starting up or tossing about. "But if you begin to do that," said the small servant, "I'll leave off. And so I tell you." "You can't leave off till you have gone on," said Dick. "And do go on. There's a darling. Speak, sister, speak." Pretty Polly say, "Oh, tell me when, and tell me where, pray, Marchioness, I beseech you." Unable to resist these fervent adjurations, which Richard Swiveller poured out as passionately as if they had been of the most solemn and tremendous nature, his companion spoke thus: "Well, before I run away, I used to sleep in the kitchen, where we played cards, you know. Miss Sally used to keep the key of the kitchen door in her pocket, and she always come down at night to take away the candle and rake out the fire. When she had done that, she left me to go to bed in the dark, locked the door on the outside, put the key in her pocket again, and kept me locked up till she come down in the morning, very early I can tell you, and let me out. I was terrible afraid of being kept like this, because if there was a fire, I thought they might forget me and only take care of themselves, you know. So, whenever I see an old rusty key anywhere, I picked it up and tried if it would fit the door, and at last I found in the dust cellar a key that did fit it." Here, Mr. Swiveller made a violent demonstration with his legs, but the small servant immediately pausing in her talk, he subsided again, and pleading a momentary forgetfulness of their compact, entreated her to proceed. "They kept me very short," said the small servant. "Oh, you can't think how short they kept me. So I used to come out at night after they'd gone to bed, and feel about in the dark for bits of biscuit, or sandwiches that you'd left in the office, or even pieces of orange peel to put into cold water and make believe it was wine. Did you ever taste orange peel in water?" Mr. Swiveller replied that he had never tasted that ardent liquor, and once more urged his friend to resume the thread of her narrative. "If you make believe very much, it's quite nice," said the small servant, "but if you don't, you know, it seems as if it would bear a little more seasoning, certainly. Well, sometimes I used to come out after they'd gone to bed, and sometimes before, you know, and 1 or 2 nights before there was all that precious noise in the office, when the young man was took. I come upstairs while Mr. Brass and Miss Sally was a-sittin' at the office fire, and I tell you the truth that I come to listen again, about the key of the safe." Mr. Swiveller gathered up his knees so as to make a great cone of the bedclothes, and conveyed into his countenance an expression of the utmost concern. But the small servant pausing, and holding up her finger, the cone gently disappeared, though the look of concern did not. "There was him and her," said the small servant, "is-sittin' by the fire, and talking softly together. Mr. Brass says to Miss Sally, upon my word, he says, it's a dangerous thing, and it might get us into a world of trouble, and I don't half like it. She says, you know her way. She says, you're the chickenest-hearted, feeblest, faintest man I ever see, and I think, she says, that I ought to have been the brother, and you the sister. Isn't Quilp, she says, our principal support? He certainly is, says Mr. Brass, and aren't we, she says, constantly ruining somebody or other in the way of business? We certainly are, says Mr. Brass. Then does it signify, she says, about ruining this kit when Quilp desires it? It certainly does not signify, says Mr. Brass. Then they whispered and laughed for a long time about there being no danger if it was well done. And then Mr. Brass pulls out his pocketbook and says, well, he says, here it is, Quilp's own £5 note. We'll agree that way, then, he says. Kit's coming tomorrow morning, I know. While he's upstairs, you'll get out of the way, and I'll clear off Mr. Richard. Having Kit alone, I'll hold him in conversation and put this property in his hat. I'll manage so, besides, he says, that Mr. Richard shall find it there and be the evidence. And if that don't get Christopher out of Mr. Quilp's way and satisfy Mr. Quilp's grudges, he says, the devil's in it. Miss Sally laughed and said that was the plan, and as they seemed to be moving away, and I was afraid to stop any longer, I went downstairs again. There. The small servant had gradually worked herself into as much agitation as Mr. Swiveller, and therefore made no effort to restrain him when he sat up in bed and hastily demanded whether this story had been told to anybody. "How could it be?" replied his nurse. "I was almost afraid to think about it, and hoped the young man would be let off. When I heard him say they had found him guilty of what he didn't do, you was gone, and so was the lodger, though I think I should have been frightened to tell him, even if he'd been there. Ever since I come here, you've been out of your senses, and what would have been the good of telling you then?" "Marchioness," said Mr. Swiveller, plucking off his nightcap and flinging it to the other end of the room, "if you'll do me the favor to retire for a few minutes and see what sort of a night it is, I'll get up." "You mustn't think of such a thing," cried his nurse. "I must indeed," said the patient, looking round the room. "Whereabouts are my clothes?" "Oh, I'm so glad. You haven't got any," replied the Marchioness. "Ma'am," said Mr. Swiveller, in great astonishment, "I've been obliged to sell them, every one, to get the things that was ordered for you." "But don't take on about that," urged the Marchioness, as Dick fell back upon his pillow. "You're too weak to stand, indeed." "I am afraid," said Richard dolefully, "that you're right. What ought I to do? What is to be done?" It naturally occurred to him, on very little reflection, that the first step to take would be to communicate with one of the Mr. Garlands instantly. It was very possible that Mr. Abel had not yet left the office. In as little time as it takes to tell it, the small servant had the address in pencil on a piece of paper, a verbal description of father and son, which would enable her to recognize either, without difficulty, and a special caution to be shy of Mr. Chuckster, in consequence of that gentleman's known antipathy to Kit. Armed with these slender powers, she hurried away, commissioned to bring either old Mr. Garland or Mr. Abel, bodily, to that apartment. "I suppose," said Dick, as she closed the door slowly and peeped into the room again, to make sure that he was comfortable, "I suppose there's nothing left, not so much as a waistcoat even?" "No, nothing." "It's embarrassing," said Mr. Swiveller. "In case of fire, even an umbrella would be something. But you did quite right, dear Marchioness. I should have died without you." Chapter 65. It was well for the small servant that she was of a sharp, quick nature, or the consequence of sending her out alone, from the very neighborhood in which it was most dangerous for her to appear, would probably have been the restoration of Miss Sally Brass to the supreme authority over her person. Not unmindful of the risk she ran, however, the Marchioness no sooner left the house than she dived into the first dark byway that presented itself. Without any present reference to the point to which her journey tended, made it her first business to put 2 good miles of brick and mortar between herself and Bevis Marks. When she had accomplished this object, she began to shape her course for the notary's office, to which, shrewdly inquiring of apple women and oyster sellers at street corners, rather than in lighted shops or of well-dressed people, at the hazard of attracting notice, she easily procured a direction. As carrier pigeons, on being first let loose in a strange place, beat the air at random for a short time before darting off towards the spot for which they are designed, so did the Marchioness flutter round and round until she believed herself in safety, and then bear swiftly down upon the port for which she was bound. She had no bonnet, nothing on her head but a great cap which, in some old time, had been worn by Sally Brass, whose taste in headdresses was, as we have seen, peculiar, and her speed was rather retarded than assisted by her shoes, which, being extremely large and slipshod, flew off every now and then, and were difficult to find again among the crowd of passengers. Indeed, the poor little creature experienced so much trouble and delay from having to grope for these articles of dress in mud and kennel, and suffered in these researches so much jostling, pushing, squeezing, and bandying from hand to hand, that by the time she reached the street in which the notary lived, she was fairly worn out and exhausted, and could not refrain from tears. But to have got there at last was a great comfort, especially as there were lights still burning in the office window, and therefore some hope that she was not too late. So the Marchioness dried her eyes with the backs of her hands, and, stealing softly up the steps, peeped in through the glass door. Mr. Chuckster was standing behind the lid of his desk, making such preparations towards finishing off for the night as pulling down his wristbands and pulling up his shirt collar, settling his neck more gracefully in his stock, and secretly arranging his whiskers by the aid of a little triangular bit of looking-glass. Before the ashes of the fire stood two gentlemen, one of whom she rightly judged to be the notary, and the other, who was buttoning his greatcoat and was evidently about to depart immediately, Mr. Abel Garland. Having made these observations, the small spy took counsel with herself, and resolved to wait in the street until Mr. Abel came out, as there would be then no fear of having to speak before Mr. Chuckster, and less difficulty in delivering her message. With this purpose she slipped out again, and crossing the road, sat down upon a doorstep just opposite. She had hardly taken this position, when there came dancing up the street, with his legs all wrong, and his head everywhere by turns, a pony. This pony had a little phaeton behind him, and a man in it. But neither man nor phaeton seemed to embarrass him in the least, as he reared up on his hind legs, or stopped, or went on, or stood still again, or backed, or went sideways, without the smallest reference to them, just as the fancy seized him, and as if he were the freest animal in creation. When they came to the notary's door, the man called out in a very respectful manner, "W.A." then, intimating that if he might venture to express a wish, it would be that they stopped there. The pony made a moment's pause, but, as if it occurred to him that to stop when he was required might be to establish an inconvenient and dangerous precedent, he immediately started off again, rattled at a fast trot to the street corner, wheeled round, came back, and then stopped of his own accord. "Oh, you're a precious creetur," said the man, who didn't venture by the by to come out in his true colors until he was safe on the pavement. "I wish I had the rewarding of you, I do." "What has he been doing?" said Mr. Abel, tying a shawl round his neck as he came down the steps. "He's enough to fret a man's heart out," replied the hostler. "He is the most vicious rascal. W.A. then, will you? He'll never stand still, if you call him names," said Mr. Abel, getting in and taking the reins. "He's a very good fellow if you know how to manage him. This is the first time he has been out, this long while, for he has lost his old driver and wouldn't stir for anybody else, till this morning. The lamps are right, are they? That's well. Be here to take him tomorrow, if you please. Good night." And after one or two strange plunges, quite of his own invention, the pony yielded to Mr. Abel's mildness, and trotted gently off. All this time Mr. Chuckster had been standing at the door, and the small servant had been afraid to approach. She had nothing for it now, therefore, but to run after the chaise, and to call to Mr. Abel to stop. Being out of breath when she came up with it, she was unable to make him hear. The case was desperate, for the pony was quickening his pace. The Marchioness hung on behind for a few moments, and, feeling that she could go no farther, and must soon yield, clambered by a vigorous effort into the hinder seat, and in so doing lost one of the shoes forever. Mr. Abel, being in a thoughtful frame of mind, and having quite enough to do to keep the pony going, went jogging on without looking round, little dreaming of the strange figure that was close behind him, until the Marchioness, having in some degree recovered her breath, and the loss of her shoe, and the novelty of her position, uttered close into his ear the words, "I say, sir." He turned his head quickly enough then, and stopping the pony, cried, with some trepidation, "God bless me, what is this?" "Don't be frightened, sir," replied the still panting messenger. "Oh, I've run such a way after you." "What do you want with me?" said Mr. Abel. "How did you come here?" "I got in behind," replied the Marchioness. "Oh, please drive on, sir. Don't stop, and go towards the city, will you? And oh, do please make haste, because it's of consequence. There's somebody wants to see you there. He sent me to say would you come directly, and that he knowed all about Kit, and could save him yet, and prove his innocence." "What do you tell me, child?" "The truth, upon my word and honor I do. But please to drive on, quick, please. I've been such a time gone. He'll think I'm lost." Mr. Abel involuntarily urged the pony forward. The pony, impelled by some secret sympathy or some new caprice, burst into a great pace, and neither slackened it, nor indulged in any eccentric performances, until they arrived at the door of Mr. Swiveller's lodging, where, marvelous to relate, he consented to stop when Mr. Abel checked him. "See, it's the room up there," said the Marchioness, pointing to one where there was a faint light. "Come." Mr. Abel, who was one of the simplest and most retiring creatures in existence, and naturally timid withal, hesitated. For he had heard of people being decoyed into strange places to be robbed and murdered, under circumstances very like the present, and, for anything he knew to the contrary, by guides very like the Marchioness. His regard for Kit, however, overcame every other consideration. So, entrusting Whisker to the charge of a man who was lingering hard by in expectation of the job, he suffered his companion to take his hand, and to lead him up the dark and narrow stairs. He was not a little surprised to find himself conducted into a dimly lighted sick chamber, where a man was sleeping tranquilly in bed. "Ain't it nice to see him lying there so quiet?" said his guide, in an earnest whisper. "Oh, you'd say it was, if you had only seen him 2 or 3 days ago." Mr. Abel made no answer, and, to say the truth, kept a long way from the bed and very near the door. His guide, who appeared to understand his reluctance, trimmed the candle, and taking it in her hand, approached the bed. As she did so, the sleeper started up, and he recognized in the wasted face the features of Richard Swiveller. "Why, how is this?" said Mr. Abel kindly, as he hurried towards him. "You have been ill?" "Very," replied Dick. "Nearly dead. You might have chanced to hear of your Richard on his bier, but for the friend I sent to fetch you. Another shake of the hand, Marchioness, if you please. Sit down, sir." Mr. Abel seemed rather astonished to hear of the quality of his guide, and took a chair by the bedside. "I have sent for you, sir," said Dick. "But she told you on what account?" "She did. I am quite bewildered by all this. I really don't know what to say or think," replied Mr. Abel. "You'll say that presently," retorted Dick. "Marchioness, take a seat on the bed, will you? Now, tell this gentleman all that you told me, and be particular. Don't you speak another word, sir." The story was repeated. It was, in effect, exactly the same as before, without any deviation or omission. Richard Swiveller kept his eyes fixed on his visitor during its narration, and directly it was concluded, took the word again. "You have heard it all, and you'll not forget it. I'm too giddy and too queer to suggest anything, but you and your friends will know what to do. After this long delay, every minute is an age. If ever you went home fast in your life, go home fast tonight. Don't stop to say one word to me, but go. She will be found here, whenever she's wanted. And as to me, you're pretty sure to find me at home, for a week or 2. There are more reasons than one for that. Marchioness, a light. If you lose another minute in looking at me, sir, I'll never forgive you." Mr. Abel needed no more remonstrance or persuasion. He was gone in an instant, and the Marchioness, returning from lighting him downstairs, reported that the pony, without any preliminary objection whatever, had dashed away at full gallop. "That's right," said Dick, "and hearty of him, and I honor him from this time. But get some supper and a mug of beer, for I am sure you must be tired. Do have a mug of beer. It will do me as much good to see you take it as if I might drink it myself." Nothing but this assurance could have prevailed upon the small nurse to indulge in such a luxury. Having eaten and drunk to Mr. Swiveller's extreme contentment, given him his drink, and put everything in neat order, she wrapped herself in an old coverlet and lay down upon the rug before the fire. Mr. Swiveller was by that time murmuring in his sleep, "Strew then, oh strew, a bed of rushes. Here will we stay, till morning blushes. Good night, Marchioness." Chapter 66. On awaking in the morning, Richard Swiveller became conscious, by slow degrees, of whispering voices in his room. Looking out between the curtains, he espied Mr. Garland, Mr. Abel, the notary, and the single gentleman, gathered round the Marchioness, and talking to her with great earnestness but in very subdued tones, fearing, no doubt, to disturb him. He lost no time in letting them know that this precaution was unnecessary, and all four gentlemen directly approached his bedside. Old Mr. Garland was the first to stretch out his hand and inquire how he felt. Dick was about to answer that he felt much better, though still as weak as need be, when his little nurse, pushing the visitors aside and pressing up to his pillow as if in jealousy of their interference, set his breakfast before him, and insisted on his taking it before he underwent the fatigue of speaking or of being spoken to. Mr. Swiveller, who was perfectly ravenous and had had, all night, amazingly distinct and consistent dreams of mutton chops, double stout, and similar delicacies, felt even the weak tea and dry toast such irresistible temptations that he consented to eat and drink on one condition. "And that is," said Dick, returning the pressure of Mr. Garland's hand, "that you answer me this question truly before I take a bit or drop. Is it too late for completing the work you began so well last night?" returned the old gentleman. "No. Set your mind at rest on that point. It is not, I assure you." Comforted by this intelligence, the patient applied himself to his food with a keen appetite, though evidently not with a greater zest in the eating than his nurse appeared to have in seeing him eat. The manner of this meal was this. Mr. Swiveller, holding the slice of toast or cup of tea in his left hand, and taking a bite or drink, as the case might be, constantly kept, in his right, one palm of the Marchioness tight locked, and to shake, or even to kiss this imprisoned hand, he would stop every now and then, in the very act of swallowing, with perfect seriousness of intention and the utmost gravity. As often as he put anything into his mouth, whether for eating or drinking, the face of the Marchioness lighted up beyond all description. But whenever he gave her one or other of these tokens of recognition, her countenance became overshadowed, and she began to sob. Now, whether she was in her laughing joy or in her crying one, the Marchioness could not help turning to the visitors with an appealing look, which seemed to say, "You see this fellow? Can I help this?" And they, being thus made, as it were, parties to the scene, as regularly answered by another look, "No, certainly not." This dumb show, taking place during the whole time of the invalid's breakfast, and the invalid himself, pale and emaciated, performing no small part in the same, it may be fairly questioned whether at any meal, where no word, good or bad, was spoken from beginning to end, so much was expressed by gestures in themselves so slight and unimportant. At length, and to say the truth before very long, Mr. Swiveller had dispatched as much toast and tea as in that stage of his recovery it was discreet to let him have. But the cares of the Marchioness did not stop here. For, disappearing for an instant and presently returning with a basin of fair water, she laved his face and hands, brushed his hair, and in short made him as spruce and smart as anybody under such circumstances could be made. And all this, in as brisk and business-like a manner, as if he were a very little boy, and she his grown-up nurse. To these various attentions, Mr. Swiveller submitted in a kind of grateful astonishment beyond the reach of language. When they were at last brought to an end, and the Marchioness had withdrawn into a distant corner to take her own poor breakfast, cold enough by that time, he turned his face away for some few moments and shook hands heartily with the air. "Gentlemen," said Dick, rousing himself from this pause, and turning round again, "you'll excuse me. Men who have been brought so low as I have been are easily fatigued. I am fresh again now, and fit for talking. We're short of chairs here, among other trifles, but if you'll do me the favor to sit upon the bed—" "What can we do for you?" said Mr. Garland kindly. "If you could make the Marchioness yonder a Marchioness in real, sober earnest," returned Dick, "I'd thank you to get it done offhand. But as you can't, and as the question is not what you will do for me, but what you will do for somebody else who has a better claim upon you, pray, sir, let me know what you intend doing." "It's chiefly on that account that we have come just now," said the single gentleman, "for you will have another visitor presently." We feared you would be anxious unless you knew from ourselves what steps we intended to take, and therefore came to you before we stirred in the matter. Gentlemen, returned Dick, I thank you. Anybody in the helpless state that you see me in is naturally anxious. Don't let me interrupt you, sir. Then, you see, my good fellow, said the single gentleman, that while we have no doubt whatever of the truth of this disclosure, which has so providentially come to light. Meaning hers? Said Dick, pointing towards the Marchioness. Meaning hers, of course, while we have no doubt of that, or that a proper use of it would procure the poor lad's immediate pardon and liberation, we have a great doubt whether it would, by itself, enable us to reach Quilp, the chief agent in this villainy. I should tell you that this doubt has been confirmed into something very nearly approaching certainty by the best opinions we have been enabled, in this short space of time, to take upon the subject. You'll agree with us, that to give him even the most distant chance of escape, if we could help it, would be monstrous. You say with us, no doubt, if somebody must escape, let it be anyone but he. Yes, returned Dick, certainly. That is if somebody must. But upon my word, I'm unwilling that anybody should, since laws were made for every degree, to curb vice in others as well as in me, and so forth, you know. Doesn't it strike you in that light? The single gentleman smiled as if the light in which Mr. Swiveller had put the question were not the clearest in the world, and proceeded to explain that they contemplated proceeding by stratagem in the first instance, and that their design was to endeavor to extort a confession from the gentle Sarah, when she finds how much we know, and how we know it, he said, and that she is clearly compromised already, we are not without strong hopes that we may be enabled through her means to punish the other two effectually. If we could do that, she might go scot-free for aught I cared. Dick received this project in anything but a gracious manner, representing with as much warmth as he was then capable of showing, that they would find the old buck, meaning Sarah, more difficult to manage than Quilp himself, that, for any tampering, terrifying, or cajolery, she was a very unpromising and unyielding subject, that she was of a kind of brass not easily melted or molded into shape, in short, that they were no match for her, and would be signally defeated. But it was in vain to urge them to adopt some other course. The single gentleman has been described as explaining their joint intentions, but it should have been written that they all spoke together, that if any one of them by chance held his peace for a moment, he stood gasping and panting for an opportunity to strike in again. In a word, that they had reached that pitch of impatience and anxiety where men can neither be persuaded nor reasoned with, and that it would have been as easy to turn the most impetuous wind that ever blew, as to prevail on them to reconsider their determination. So, after telling Mr. Swiveller how they had not lost sight of Kit's mother and the children, how they had never once even lost sight of Kit himself, but had been unremitting in their endeavors to procure a mitigation of his sentence, how they had been perfectly distracted between the strong proofs of his guilt and their own fading hopes of his innocence, and how he, Richard Swiveller, might keep his mind at rest, for everything should be happily adjusted between that time and night. After telling him all this, and adding a great many kind and cordial expressions personal to himself, which it is unnecessary to recite, Mr. Garland, the notary, and the single gentleman took their leaves at a very critical time, or Richard Swiveller must assuredly have been driven into another fever, whereof the results might have been fatal. Mr. Abel remained behind, very often looking at his watch and at the room door, until Mr. Swiveller was roused from a short nap by the setting down on the landing-place outside, as from the shoulders of a porter, of some giant load, which seemed to shake the house, and made the little physic bottles on the mantel-shelf ring again. Directly this sound reached his ears, Mr. Abel started up, and hobbled to the door, and opened it, and behold, there stood a strong man, with a mighty hamper, which, being hauled into the room and presently unpacked, disgorged such treasures as tea, and coffee, and wine, and rusks, and oranges, and grapes, and fowls ready trussed for boiling, and calf's foot jelly, and arrowroot, and sago, and other delicate restoratives, that the small servant, who had never thought it possible that such things could be, except in shops, stood rooted to the spot in her one shoe, with her mouth and eyes watering in unison, and her power of speech quite gone. But not so Mr. Abel, or the strong man who emptied the hamper, big as it was, in a twinkling, and not so the nice old lady, who appeared so suddenly that she might have come out of the hamper too, it was quite large enough, and who, bustling about on tiptoe and without noise, now here, now there, now everywhere at once, began to fill out the jelly in teacups, and to make chicken broth in small saucepans, and to peel oranges for the sick man, and to cut them up in little pieces, and to ply the small servant with glasses of wine and choice bits of everything until more substantial meat could be prepared for her refreshment. The whole of which appearances were so unexpected and bewildering that Mr. Swiveller, when he had taken 2 oranges and a little jelly, and had seen the strong man walk off with the empty basket, plainly leaving all that abundance for his use and benefit, was fain to lie down and fall asleep again, from sheer inability to entertain such wonders in his mind. Meanwhile, the single gentleman, the notary, and Mr. Garland repaired to a certain coffee-house, and from that place indited and sent a letter to Miss Sally Brass, requesting her, in terms mysterious and brief, to favor an unknown friend who wished to consult her, with her company there, as speedily as possible. The communication performed its errand so well, that within 10 minutes of the messenger's return and report of its delivery, Miss Brass herself was announced. "Pray, ma'am," said the single gentleman, whom she found alone in the room, "take a chair." Miss Brass sat herself down, in a very stiff and frigid state, and seemed, as indeed she was, not a little astonished to find that the lodger and her mysterious correspondent were one and the same person. "You did not expect to see me?" said the single gentleman. "I didn't think much about it," returned the beauty. "I supposed it was business of some kind or other. If it's about the apartments, of course you'll give my brother regular notice, you know, or money. That's very easily settled. You're a responsible party, and in such a case lawful money and lawful notice are pretty much the same." "I am obliged to you for your good opinion," retorted the single gentleman, "and quite concur in these sentiments. But that is not the subject on which I wish to speak with you." "Oh," said Sally, "then just state the particulars, will you? I suppose it's professional business?" "Why, it is connected with the law, certainly." "Very well," returned Miss Brass. "My brother and I are just the same. I can take any instructions or give you any advice." "As there are other parties interested besides myself," said the single gentleman, rising and opening the door of an inner room, "we had better confer together. Miss Brass is here, gentlemen." Mr. Garland and the notary walked in, looking very grave, and, drawing up 2 chairs, one on each side of the single gentleman, formed a kind of fence round the gentle Sarah, and pinned her into a corner. Her brother Sampson under such circumstances would certainly have evinced some confusion or anxiety, but she, all composure, pulled out the tin box and calmly took a pinch of snuff. "Miss Brass," said the notary, taking the word at this crisis, "we professional people understand each other, and, when we choose, can say what we have to say, in very few words. You advertised a runaway servant the other day?" "Well," returned Miss Sally, with a sudden flush overspreading her features, "what of that?" "She is found, ma'am," said the notary, pulling out his pocket-handkerchief with a flourish. "She is found." "Who found her?" demanded Sarah hastily. "We did, ma'am, we 3. Only last night, or you would have heard from us before." "And now I have heard from you," said Miss Brass, folding her arms as though she were about to deny something to the death. "What have you got to say? Something you have got into your heads about her, of course. Prove it, will you? That's all. Prove it. You have found her, you say. I can tell you, if you don't know it, that you have found the most artful, lying, pilfering, devilish little minx that was ever born. Have you got her here?" she added, looking sharply round. "No, she is not here at present," returned the notary, "but she is quite safe." "Ha!" cried Sally, twitching a pinch of snuff out of her box, as spitefully as if she were in the very act of wrenching off the small servant's nose. "She shall be safe enough from this time, I warrant you." "I hope so," replied the notary. "Did it occur to you for the first time, when you found she had run away, that there were 2 keys to your kitchen door?" Miss Sally took another pinch, and putting her head on one side, looked at her questioner with a curious kind of spasm about her mouth, but with a cunning aspect of immense expression. "2 keys," repeated the notary. "One of which gave her the opportunities of roaming through the house at nights when you supposed her fast locked up, and of overhearing confidential consultations, among others, that particular conference, to be described today before a justice, which you will have an opportunity of hearing her relate. That conference which you and Mr. Brass held together on the night before that most unfortunate and innocent young man was accused of robbery by a horrible device, of which I will only say that it may be characterized by the epithets which you have applied to this wretched little witness, and by a few stronger ones besides." Sally took another pinch. Although her face was wonderfully composed, it was apparent that she was wholly taken by surprise, and that what she had expected to be taxed with in connection with her small servant was something very different from this. "Come, come, Miss Brass," said the notary, "you have great command of feature, but you feel, I see, that by a chance which never entered your imagination, this base design is revealed, and 2 of its plotters must be brought to justice. Now, you know the pains and penalties you are liable to, and so I need not dilate upon them, but I have a proposal to make to you. You have the honor of being sister to one of the greatest scoundrels unhung, and if I may venture to say so to a lady, you are in every respect quite worthy of him. But connected with you 2 is a third party, a villain of the name of Quilp, the prime mover of the whole diabolical device, who I believe to be worse than either. For his sake, Miss Brass, do us the favor to reveal the whole history of this affair. Let me remind you that your doing so, at our instance, will place you in a safe and comfortable position. Your present one is not desirable, and cannot injure your brother. For against him and you we have quite sufficient evidence, as you hear, already. I will not say to you that we suggest this course in mercy, for, to tell you the truth, we do not entertain any regard for you. But it is a necessity to which we are reduced, and I recommend it to you as a matter of the very best policy." "Time," said Mr. Witherden, pulling out his watch, "in a business like this, is exceedingly precious. Favor us with your decision as speedily as possible, ma'am." With a smile upon her face, and looking at each of the 3 by turns, Miss Brass took 2 or 3 more pinches of snuff, and having by this time very little left, traveled round and round the box with her forefinger and thumb, scraping up another. Having disposed of this likewise, and put the box carefully in her pocket, she said, "I am to accept or reject at once, am I?" "Yes," said Mr. Witherden. The charming creature was opening her lips to speak in reply, when the door was hastily opened too, and the head of Sampson Brass was thrust into the room. "Excuse me," said the gentleman hastily. "Wait a bit." So saying, and quite indifferent to the astonishment his presence occasioned, he crept in, shut the door, kissed his greasy glove as servilely as if it were the dust, and made a most abject bow. "Sarah," said Brass, "hold your tongue if you please, and let me speak. Gentlemen, if I could express the pleasure it gives me to see 3 such men in a happy unity of feeling and concord of sentiment, I think you would hardly believe me. But though I am unfortunate, nay, gentlemen, criminal, if we are to use harsh expressions in a company like this, still, I have my feelings like other men. I have heard of a poet who remarked that feelings were the common lot of all. If he could have been a pig, gentlemen, and have uttered that sentiment, he would still have been immortal. If you're not an idiot," said Miss Brass harshly, "hold your peace." "Sarah, my dear," returned her brother, "thank you. But I know what I am about, my love, and will take the liberty of expressing myself accordingly. Mr. Witherden, sir, your handkerchief is hanging out of your pocket. Would you allow me to?" As Mr. Brass advanced to remedy this accident, The notary shrunk from him with an air of disgust. Brass, who over and above his usual prepossessing qualities, had a scratched face, a green shade over one eye, and a hat grievously crushed, stopped short, and looked round with a pitiful smile. "He shuns me," said Sampson, "even when I would, as I may say, heap coals of fire upon his head. Well, but I am a falling house, and the rats, if I may be allowed the expression in reference to a gentleman I respect and love beyond everything, fly from me. Gentlemen, regarding your conversation just now, I happened to see my sister on her way here, and, wondering where she could be going to, and being, may I venture to say, naturally of a suspicious turn, followed her. Since then, I have been listening." "If you're not mad," interposed Miss Sally, "stop there and say no more." "Sarah, my dear," rejoined Brass with undiminished politeness, "I thank you kindly, but will still proceed. Mr. Witherden, sir, as we have the honor to be members of the same profession, to say nothing of that other gentleman having been my lodger, and having partaken, as one may say, of the hospitality of my roof, I think you might have given me the refusal of this offer in the first instance." "I do indeed." "Now, my dear sir," cried Brass, seeing that the notary was about to interrupt him, "suffer me to speak, I beg." Mr. Witherden was silent, and Brass went on. "If you will do me the favor," he said, holding up the green shade, and revealing an eye most horribly discolored, "to look at this, you will naturally inquire, in your own minds, how did I get it? If you look from that to my face, you will wonder what could have been the cause of all these scratches, and if from them to my hat, how it came into the state in which you see it." "Gentlemen," said Brass, striking the hat fiercely with his clenched hand, "to all these questions I answer, Quilp." The three gentlemen looked at each other, but said nothing. "I say," pursued Brass, glancing aside at his sister, as though he were talking for her information, and speaking with a snarling malignity, in violent contrast to his usual smoothness, "that I answer to all these questions, Quilp, who deludes me into his infernal den, and takes a delight in looking on and chuckling while I scorch, and burn, and bruise, and maim myself. Quilp, who never once, no never once, in all our communications together, has treated me otherwise than as a dog. Quilp, whom I have always hated with my whole heart, but never so much as lately. He gives me the cold shoulder on this very matter, as if he had had nothing to do with it, instead of being the first to propose it. I can't trust him. In one of his howling, raving, blazing humors, I believe he'd let it out, if it was murder, and never think of himself so long as he could terrify me. Now," said Brass, picking up his hat again and replacing the shade over his eye, and actually crouching down, in the excess of his servility, "what does all this lead to? What should you say it led me to, gentlemen? Could you guess at all near the mark?" Nobody spoke. Brass stood smirking for a little while, as if he had propounded some choice conundrum, and then said, "To be short with you, then it leads me to this. If the truth has come out, as it plainly has in a manner that there's no standing up against, and a very sublime and grand thing is truth, gentlemen, in its way, though like other sublime and grand things, such as thunderstorms and that, we're not always over and above glad to see it. I had better turn upon this man than let this man turn upon me. It's clear to me that I am done for. Therefore, if anybody is to split, I had better be the person and have the advantage of it. Sarah, my dear, comparatively speaking, you're safe. I relate these circumstances for my own profit." With that, Mr. Brass, in a great hurry, revealed the whole story, bearing as heavily as possible on his amiable employer, and making himself out to be rather a saint-like and holy character, though subject, he acknowledged, to human weaknesses. He concluded thus, "Now, gentlemen, I am not a man who does things by halves. Being in for a penny, I am ready, as the saying is, to be in for a pound. You must do with me what you please, and take me where you please. If you wish to have this in writing, we'll reduce it into manuscript immediately. You will be tender with me, I am sure. I am quite confident you will be tender with me. You are men of honor and have feeling hearts. I yielded from necessity to Quilp, for though necessity has no law, she has her lawyers. I yield to you from necessity too, from policy besides, and because of feelings that have been a pretty long time working within me. Punish Quilp, gentlemen. Weigh heavily upon him. Grind him down. Tread him under foot. He has done as much by me, for many and many a day. Having now arrived at the conclusion of his discourse, Samson checked the current of his wrath, kissed his glove again, and smiled as only parasites and cowards can. "And this," said Miss Brass, raising her head, with which she had hitherto sat resting on her hands, and surveying him from head to foot with a bitter sneer, "this is my brother, is it? This is my brother, that I have worked and toiled for, and believed to have had something of the man in him." "Sarah, my dear," returned Samson, rubbing his hands feebly, "you disturb our friends. Besides you're disappointed, Sarah, and, not knowing what you say, expose yourself." "Yes, you pitiful dastard," retorted the lovely damsel, "I understand you. You feared that I should be beforehand with you. But do you think that I would have been enticed to say a word? I'd have scorned it, if they had tried and tempted me for 20 years. He, simpered Brass, who, in his deep debasement, really seemed to have changed sexes with his sister, and to have made over to her any spark of manliness he might have possessed. "You think so, Sarah, you think so perhaps, but you would have acted quite different, my good fellow. You will not have forgotten that it was a maxim with Foxy, our revered father, gentlemen, always suspect everybody. That's the maxim to go through life with. If you were not actually about to purchase your own safety when I showed myself, I suspect you'd have done it by this time, and therefore I've done it myself, and spared you the trouble as well as the shame. The shame, gentlemen," added Brass, allowing himself to be slightly overcome, "if there is any, is mine. It's better that a female should be spared it." With deference to the better opinion of Mr. Brass, and more particularly to the authority of his great ancestor, it may be doubted, with humility, whether the elevating principle laid down by the latter gentleman and acted upon by his descendant is always a prudent one, or attended in practice with the desired results. This is, beyond question, a bold and presumptuous doubt, inasmuch as many distinguished characters, called men of the world, long-headed customers, knowing dogs, shrewd fellows, capital hands at business, and the like, have made, and do daily make, this axiom their polar star and compass. Still, the doubt may be gently insinuated, and in illustration it may be observed that if Mr. Brass, not being over-suspicious, had, without prying and listening, left his sister to manage the conference on their joint behalf, or prying and listening, had not been in such a mighty hurry to anticipate her, which he would not have been, but for his distrust and jealousy, he would probably have found himself much better off in the end. Thus, it will always happen that these men of the world, who go through it in armor, defend themselves from quite as much good as evil, to say nothing of the inconvenience and absurdity of mounting guard with a microscope at all times, and of wearing a coat of mail on the most innocent occasions. The three gentlemen spoke together apart, for a few moments. At the end of their consultation, which was very brief, the notary pointed to the writing materials on the table, and informed Mr. Brass that if he wished to make any statement in writing, he had the opportunity of doing so. At the same time, he felt bound to tell him that they would require his attendance, presently, before a justice of the peace, and that in what he did or said, he was guided entirely by his own discretion. "Gentlemen," said Brass, drawing off his glove, and crawling in spirit upon the ground before them, "I will justify the tenderness with which I know I shall be treated. And as, without tenderness, I should, now that this discovery has been made, stand in the worst position of the three, you may depend upon it I will make a clean breast. Mr. Witherden, sir, a kind of faintness is upon my spirits. If you would do me the favor to ring the bell and order up a glass of something warm and spicy, I shall, notwithstanding what is past, have a melancholy pleasure in drinking your good health. I had hoped," said Brass, looking round with a mournful smile. "To have seen you 3 gentlemen, one day or another, with your legs under the mahogany in my humble parlor in the Marks. But hopes are fleeting. Dear me." Mr. Brass found himself so exceedingly affected at this point that he could say or do nothing more until some refreshment arrived. Having partaken of it pretty freely for one in his agitated state, he sat down to write. The lovely Sarah, now with her arms folded, and now with her hands clasped behind her, paced the room with manly strides while her brother was thus employed, and sometimes stopped to pull out her snuff-box and bite the lid. She continued to pace up and down until she was quite tired, and then fell asleep on a chair near the door. It has been since supposed, with some reason, that this slumber was a sham or feint, as she contrived to slip away unobserved in the dusk of the afternoon. Whether this was an intentional and waking departure, or a somnambulistic leave-taking and walking in her sleep, may remain a subject of contention. But, on one point, and indeed the main one, all parties are agreed. In whatever state she walked away, she certainly did not walk back again. Mention having been made of the dusk of the afternoon, it will be inferred that Mr. Brass's task occupied some time in the completion. It was not finished until evening, but, being done at last, that worthy person and the 3 friends adjourned in a hackney coach to the private office of a justice, who, giving Mr. Brass a warm reception and detaining him in a secure place that he might ensure to himself the pleasure of seeing him on the morrow, dismissed the others with the cheering assurance that a warrant could not fail to be granted next day for the apprehension of Mr. Quilp, and that a proper application and statement of all the circumstances to the Secretary of State, who was fortunately in town, would no doubt procure Kit's free pardon and liberation without delay. And now, indeed, it seemed that Quilp's malignant career was drawing to a close, and that retribution, which often travels slowly, especially when heaviest, had tracked his footsteps with a sure and certain scent and was gaining on him fast. Unmindful of her stealthy tread, her victim holds his course in fancied triumph. Still at his heels she comes, and once afoot, is never turned aside. Their business ended, the 3 gentlemen hastened back to the lodgings of Mr. Swiveller, whom they found progressing so favorably in his recovery as to have been able to sit up for half an hour, and to have conversed with cheerfulness. Mrs. Garland had gone home some time since, but Mr. Abel was still sitting with him. After telling him all they had done, the 2 Mr. Garlands and the single gentleman, as if by some previous understanding, took their leaves for the night, leaving the invalid alone with the notary and the small servant. "As you are so much better," said Mr. Witherden, sitting down at the bedside, "I may venture to communicate to you a piece of news which has come to me professionally." The idea of any professional intelligence from a gentleman connected with legal matters appeared to afford Richard anything but a pleasing anticipation. Perhaps he connected it in his own mind with 1 or 2 outstanding accounts, in reference to which he had already received divers threatening letters. His countenance fell as he replied, "Certainly, sir. I hope it's not anything of a very disagreeable nature, though. If I thought it so, I should choose some better time for communicating it," replied the notary. "Let me tell you first that my friends who have been here today know nothing of it, and that their kindness to you has been quite spontaneous and with no hope of return. It may do a thoughtless, careless man good to know that." Dick thanked him, and said he hoped it would. "I have been making some inquiries about you," said Mr. Witherden, "little thinking that I should find you under such circumstances as those which have brought us together. You are the nephew of Rebecca Swiveller, spinster, deceased, of Cheselbourne in Dorsetshire." "Deceased!" cried Dick. "Deceased! If you had been another sort of nephew, you would have come into possession, so says the will, and I see no reason to doubt it, of £25,000. As it is, you have fallen into an annuity of £150 a year, but I think I may congratulate you even upon that." "Sir," said Dick, sobbing and laughing together, "you may, for, please God, we'll make a scholar of the poor Marchioness yet." and she shall walk in silk attire, and siller have to spare, or may I never rise from this bed again. Chapter 67. Unconscious of the proceedings faithfully narrated in the last chapter, and little dreaming of the mine which had been sprung beneath him, for, to the end that he should have no warning of the business afoot, the profoundest secrecy was observed in the whole transaction. Mr. Quilp remained shut up in his hermitage, undisturbed by any suspicion, and extremely well satisfied with the result of his machinations. Being engaged in the adjustment of some accounts, an occupation to which the silence and solitude of his retreat were very favorable, he had not strayed from his den for 2 whole days. The 3rd day of his devotion to this pursuit found him still hard at work, and little disposed to stir abroad. It was the day next after Mr. Brass's confession, and consequently, that which threatened the restriction of Mr. Quilp's liberty, and the abrupt communication to him of some very unpleasant and unwelcome facts. Having no intuitive perception of the cloud which lowered upon his house, the dwarf was in his ordinary state of cheerfulness, and, when he found he was becoming too much engrossed by business with a due regard to his health and spirits, he varied its monotonous routine with a little screeching, or howling, or some other innocent relaxation of that nature. He was attended, as usual, by Tom Scott, who sat crouching over the fire after the manner of a toad, and from time to time, when his master's back was turned, imitating his grimaces with a fearful exactness. The figurehead had not yet disappeared, but remained in its old place. The face, horribly seared by the frequent application of the red-hot poker, and further ornamented by the insertion, in the tip of the nose, of a 10-penny nail, yet smiled blandly in its less lacerated parts, and seemed, like a sturdy martyr, to provoke its tormentor to the commission of new outrages and insults. The day, in the highest and brightest quarters of the town, was damp, dark, cold, and gloomy. In that low and marshy spot, the fog filled every nook and corner with a thick, dense cloud. Every object was obscure at 1 or 2 yards' distance. The warning lights and fires upon the river were powerless beneath this pall, and, but for a raw and piercing chillness in the air, and now and then the cry of some bewildered boatman as he rested on his oars and tried to make out where he was, the river itself might have been miles away. The mist, though sluggish and slow to move, was of a keenly searching kind. No muffling up in furs and broadcloth kept it out. It seemed to penetrate into the very bones of the shrinking wayfarers, and to rack them with cold and pains. Everything was wet and clammy to the touch. The warm blaze alone defied it, and leaped and sparkled merrily. It was a day to be at home, crowding about the fire, telling stories of travelers who had lost their way in such weather on heaths and moors, and to love a warm hearth more than ever. The dwarf's humor, as we know, was to have a fireside to himself, and when he was disposed to be convivial, to enjoy himself alone. By no means insensible to the comfort of being within doors, he ordered Tom Scott to pile the little stove with coals, and, dismissing his work for that day, determined to be jovial. To this end, he lighted up fresh candles and heaped more fuel on the fire, and having dined off a beefsteak, which he cooked himself in somewhat of a savage and cannibal-like manner, brewed a great bowl of hot punch, lighted his pipe, and sat down to spend the evening. At this moment, a low knocking at the cabin door arrested his attention. When it had been twice or thrice repeated, he softly opened the little window, and thrusting his head out, demanded who was there. "Only me, Quilp," replied a woman's voice. "Only you," cried the dwarf, stretching his neck to obtain a better view of his visitor. "And what brings you here, you jade? How dare you approach the ogre's castle, eh?" "I have come with some news," rejoined his spouse. "Don't be angry with me." "Is it good news, pleasant news, news to make a man skip and snap his fingers?" said the dwarf. "Is the dear old lady dead?" "I don't know what news it is, or whether it's good or bad," rejoined his wife. "Then she's alive," said Quilp, "and there's nothing the matter with her. Go home again, you bird of evil note, go home." "I have brought a letter," cried the meek little woman. "Toss it in at the window here, and go your ways," said Quilp, interrupting her, "or I'll come out and scratch you." "No, but please, Quilp, do hear me speak," urged his submissive wife in tears. "Please do." "Speak then," growled the dwarf with a malicious grin. "Be quick and short about it. Speak, will you?" "It was left at our house this afternoon," said Mrs. Quilp, trembling, "by a boy who said he didn't know from whom it came, but that it was given to him to leave, and that he was told to say it must be brought on to you directly, for it was of the very greatest consequence. But please," she added, as her husband stretched out his hand for it, "please let me in. You don't know how wet and cold I am, or how many times I have lost my way in coming here through this thick fog. Let me dry myself at the fire for 5 minutes. I'll go away directly you tell me to, Quilp. Upon my word I will." Her amiable husband hesitated for a few moments, but, bethinking himself that the letter might require some answer, of which she could be the bearer, closed the window, opened the door, and bade her enter. Mrs. Quilp obeyed right willingly, and, kneeling down before the fire to warm her hands, delivered into his a little packet. "I'm glad you're wet," said Quilp, snatching it and squinting at her. "I'm glad you're cold. I'm glad you lost your way. I'm glad your eyes are red with crying. It does my heart good to see your little nose so pinched and frosty." "Oh, Quilp," sobbed his wife, "how cruel it is of you." "Did she think I was dead?" said Quilp, wrinkling his face into a most extraordinary series of grimaces. "Did she think she was going to have all the money and to marry somebody she liked? Ha ha ha! Did she?" These taunts elicited no reply from the poor little woman, who remained on her knees, warming her hands and sobbing, to Mr. Quilp's great delight. But, just as he was contemplating her and chuckling excessively, he happened to observe that Tom Scott was delighted too. Wherefore, that he might have no presumptuous partner in his glee, the dwarf instantly collared him, dragged him to the door, and after a short scuffle, kicked him into the yard. In return for this mark of attention, Tom immediately walked upon his hands to the window, and, if the expression be allowable, looked in with his shoes, besides rattling his feet upon the glass like a banshee upside down. As a matter of course, Mr. Quilp lost no time in resorting to the infallible poker, with which, after some dodging and lying in ambush, he paid his young friend 1 or 2 such unequivocal compliments that he vanished precipitately and left him in quiet possession of the field. "So, that little job being disposed of," said the dwarf coolly, "I'll read my letter." "Humph," he muttered, looking at the direction. "I ought to know this writing. Beautiful Sally." Opening it, he read, in a fair, round, legal hand, as follows: "Sammy has been practiced upon, and has broken confidence. It has all come out. You had better not be in the way, for strangers are going to call upon you. They have been very quiet as yet, because they mean to surprise you. Don't lose time. I didn't. I am not to be found anywhere. If I was you, I wouldn't either. S.B. Late of B.M." To describe the changes that passed over Quilp's face as he read this letter half a dozen times would require some new language, such, for power of expression, as was never written, read, or spoken. For a long time he did not utter one word. But, after a considerable interval, during which Mrs. Quilp was almost paralyzed with the alarm his looks engendered, he contrived to gasp out, "If I had him here. If I only had him here." "Oh, Quilp," said his wife, "what's the matter? Who are you angry with?" "I should drown him," said the dwarf, not heeding her. "Too easy a death, too short, too quick, but the river runs close at hand. Oh, if I had him here, just to take him to the brink coaxingly and pleasantly, holding him by the buttonhole, joking with him, and, with a sudden push, to send him splashing down. Drowning men come to the surface 3 times, they say. Ah, to see him those 3 times, and mock him as his face came bobbing up. Oh, what a rich treat that would be." "Quilp," stammered his wife, venturing at the same time to touch him on the shoulder. "What has gone wrong?" She was so terrified by the relish with which he pictured this pleasure to himself that she could scarcely make herself intelligible. "Such a bloodless cur," said Quilp, rubbing his hands very slowly and pressing them tight together. "I thought his cowardice and servility were the best guarantee for his keeping silence. Oh, Brass, Brass, my dear, good, affectionate, faithful, complimentary, charming friend, if I only had you here." His wife, who had retreated lest she should seem to listen to these mutterings, ventured to approach him again, and was about to speak, when he hurried to the door and called Tom Scott, who, remembering his late gentle admonition, deemed it prudent to appear immediately. "There," said the dwarf, pulling him in, "take her home. Don't come here tomorrow, for this place will be shut up. Come back no more till you hear from me or see me. Do you mind?" Tom nodded sulkily and beckoned Mrs. Quilp to lead the way. "As for you," said the dwarf, addressing himself to her, "ask no questions about me, make no search for me, say nothing concerning me. I shall not be dead, mistress, and that'll comfort you. He'll take care of you. But, Quilp, what is the matter? Where are you going? Do say something more." "I'll say that," said the dwarf, seizing her by the arm, "and do that too, which undone and unsaid would be best for you, unless you go directly." "Has anything happened?" cried his wife. "Oh, do tell me that." "Yes," snarled the dwarf. "No. What matter which? I have told you what to do. Woe betide you if you fail to do it, or disobey me by a hair's breadth. Will you go?" "I am going. I'll go directly. But," faltered his wife, "answer me one question first. Has this letter any connection with dear little Nell? I must ask you that. I must indeed, Quilp. You cannot think what days and nights of sorrow I have had through having once deceived that child. I don't know what harm I may have brought about, but, great or little, I did it for you, Quilp. My conscience misgave me when I did it. Do answer me this question, if you please." The exasperated dwarf returned no answer, but turned round and caught up his usual weapon with such vehemence that Tom Scott dragged his charge away by main force and as swiftly as he could. It was well he did so, for Quilp, who was nearly mad with rage, pursued them to the neighboring lane, and might have prolonged the chase but for the dense mist which obscured them from his view and appeared to thicken every moment. "It will be a good night for traveling anonymously," he said, as he returned slowly, being pretty well breathed with his run. "Stay, we may look better here. This is too hospitable and free." By a great exertion of strength, he closed the two old gates, which were deeply sunken in the mud, and barred them with a heavy beam. That done, he shook his matted hair from about his eyes, and tried them strong and fast. "The fence between this wharf and the next is easily climbed," said the dwarf, when he had taken these precautions. "There's a back lane, too, from there. That shall be my way out. A man need know his road well to find it in this lovely place tonight. I need fear no unwelcome visitors while this lasts, I think." Almost reduced to the necessity of groping his way with his hands, it had grown so dark and the fog had so much increased, he returned to his lair, and after musing for some time over the fire, busied himself in preparations for a speedy departure. While he was collecting a few necessaries and cramming them into his pockets, he never once ceased communing with himself in a low voice, or unclenched his teeth, which he had ground together on finishing Miss Brass's note. "Oh, Samson," he muttered, "good worthy creature, if I could but hug you, if I could only fold you in my arms and squeeze your ribs, as I could squeeze them if I once had you tight, what a meeting there would be between us. If we ever do cross each other again, Samson, we'll have a greeting not easily to be forgotten, trust me. This time, Samson, this moment when all had gone on so well, was so nicely chosen. It was so thoughtful of you, so penitent, so good. Oh, if we were face to face in this room again, my white-livered man of law, how well contented one of us would be." There he stopped, and raising the bowl of punch to his lips, drank a long, deep draught, as if it were fair water and cooling to his parched mouth. Setting it down abruptly and resuming his preparations, he went on with his soliloquy. "There's Sally," he said, with flashing eyes. "The woman has spirit, determination, purpose. Was she asleep or petrified? She could have stabbed him, poisoned him safely. She might have seen this coming on. Why does she give me notice when it's too late? When he sat there, yonder there, over there, with his white face and red head and sickly smile, why didn't I know what was passing in his heart? It should have stopped beating that night if I had been in his secret, or there are no drugs to lull a man to sleep, or no fire to burn him." Another draught from the bowl, and cowering over the fire with a ferocious aspect, he muttered to himself again. "And this, like every other trouble and anxiety I have had of late times, springs from that old dotard and his darling child, two wretched feeble wanderers. I'll be their evil genius yet. And you, sweet Kit, honest Kit, virtuous, innocent Kit, look to yourself. Where I hate, I bite. I hate you, my darling fellow, with good cause, and proud as you are tonight. I'll have my turn, da. What's that?" A knocking at the gate he had closed. A loud and violent knocking. Then a pause, as if those who knocked had stopped to listen. Then the noise again, more clamorous and importunate than before. "So soon," said the dwarf, "and so eager. I am afraid I shall disappoint you. It's well I'm quite prepared. Sally, I thank you." As he spoke, he extinguished the candle. In his impetuous attempts to subdue the brightness of the fire, he overset the stove, which came tumbling forward and fell with a crash upon the burning embers it had shot forth in its descent, leaving the room in pitchy darkness. The noise at the gate still continuing, he felt his way to the door and stepped into the open air. At that moment the knocking ceased. It was about 8 o'clock, but the dead of the darkest night would have been as noonday in comparison with the thick cloud which then rested upon the earth and shrouded everything from view. He darted forward for a few paces, as if into the mouth of some dim, yawning cavern. Then, thinking he had gone wrong, changed the direction of his steps, then stood still, not knowing where to turn. "If they would knock again," said Quilp, trying to peer into the gloom by which he was surrounded, "the sound might guide me. Come, batter the gate once more." He stood listening intently, but the noise was not renewed. Nothing was to be heard in that deserted place, but, at intervals, the distant barkings of dogs. The sound was far away, now in one quarter, now answered in another, nor was it any guide, for it often came from shipboard, as he knew. "If I could find a wall or fence," said the dwarf, stretching out his arms and walking slowly on, "I should know which way to turn. A good, black, devil's night this, to have my dear friend here. If I had but that wish, it might, for anything I cared, never be day again." As the word passed his lips, he staggered and fell, and next moment was fighting with the cold, dark water. For all its bubbling up and rushing in his ears, he could hear the knocking at the gate again, could hear a shout that followed it, could recognize the voice. For all his struggling and plashing, he could understand that they had lost their way and had wandered back to the point from which they started, that they were all but looking on while he was drowned, that they were close at hand but could not make an effort to save him, that he himself had shut and barred them out. He answered the shout with a yell which seemed to make the 100 fires that danced before his eyes tremble and flicker, as if a gust of wind had stirred them. It was of no avail. The strong tide filled his throat and bore him on, upon its rapid current. Another mortal struggle, and he was up again, beating the water with his hands and looking out with wild and glaring eyes that showed him some black object he was drifting close upon. The hull of a ship. He could touch its smooth and slippery surface with his hand. One loud cry, now, but the resistless water bore him down before he could give it utterance, and, driving him under it, carried away a corpse. It toyed and sported with its ghastly freight, now bruising it against the slimy piles, now hiding it in mud or long rank grass, now dragging it heavily over rough stones and gravel, now feigning to yield it to its own element, and in the same action luring it away, until, tired of the ugly plaything, it flung it on a swamp, a dismal place where pirates had swung in chains through many a wintry night, and left it there to bleach. And there it lay alone. The sky was red with flame, and the water that bore it there had been tinged with the sullen light as it flowed along. The place the deserted carcass had left so recently, a living man, was now a blazing ruin. There was something of the glare upon its face. The hair, stirred by the damp breeze, played in a kind of mockery of death, such a mockery as the dead man himself would have delighted in when alive. About its head, and its dress fluttered idly in the night wind. Chapter 68. Lighted rooms, bright fires, cheerful faces, the music of glad voices, words of love and welcome, warm hearts and tears of happiness. What a change is this! But it is to such delights that Kit is hastening. They are awaiting him, he knows. He fears he will die of joy before he gets among them. They have prepared him for this, all day. He is not to be carried off tomorrow with the rest, they tell him first. By degrees they let him know that doubts have arisen, that inquiries are to be made, and perhaps he may be pardoned after all. At last, the evening being come, they bring him to a room where some gentlemen are assembled. Foremost among them is his good old master, who comes and takes him by the hand. He hears that his innocence is established, and that he is pardoned. He cannot see the speaker, but he turns towards the voice, and in trying to answer, falls down insensible. They recover him again, and tell him he must be composed, and bear this like a man. Somebody says he must think of his poor mother. It is because he does think of her so much, that the happy news had overpowered him. They crowd about him, and tell him that the truth has gone abroad, and that all the town and country ring with sympathy for his misfortunes. He has no ears for this. His thoughts, as yet, have no wider range than home. Does she know it? What did she say? Who told her? He can speak of nothing else. They make him drink a little wine, and talk kindly to him for a while, until he is more collected, and can listen, and thank them. He is free to go. Mr. Garland thinks, if he feels better, it is time they went away. The gentlemen cluster round him, and shake hands with him. He feels very grateful to them for the interest they have in him, and for the kind promises they make. But the power of speech is gone again, and he has much ado to keep his feet, even though leaning on his master's arm. As they come through the dismal passages, some officers of the jail who are in waiting there congratulate him, in their rough way, on his release. The newsmonger is of the number, but his manner is not quite hearty. There is something of surliness in his compliments. He looks upon Kit as an intruder, as one who has obtained admission to that place on false pretenses, who has enjoyed a privilege without being duly qualified. He may be a very good sort of young man, he thinks, but he has no business there, and the sooner he is gone, the better. The last door shuts behind them. They have passed the outer wall, and stand in the open air. In the street he has so often pictured to himself when hemmed in by the gloomy stones, and which has been in all his dreams. It seems wider and more busy than it used to be. The night is bad, and yet how cheerful and gay in his eyes. One of the gentlemen, in taking leave of him, pressed some money into his hand. He has not counted it, but when they have gone a few paces beyond the box for poor prisoners, he hastily returns and drops it in. Mr. Garland has a coach waiting in a neighboring street, and, taking Kit inside with him, bids the man drive home. At first, they can only travel at a foot pace, and then with torches going on before, because of the heavy fog. But, as they get farther from the river, and leave the closer portions of the town behind, they are able to dispense with this precaution and to proceed at a brisker rate. On the road, hard galloping would be too slow for Kit, but when they are drawing near their journey's end, he begs they may go more slowly, and when the house appears in sight, that they may stop, only for a minute or two, to give him time to breathe. But there is no stopping then, for the old gentleman speaks stoutly to him. The horses mend their pace, and they are already at the garden gate. Next minute, they are at the door. There is a noise of tongues and tread of feet inside. It opens. Kit rushes in and finds his mother clinging round his neck. And there, too, is the ever-faithful Barbara's mother, still holding the baby as if she had never put it down since that sad day when they little hoped to have such joy as this. There she is, heaven bless her, crying her eyes out and sobbing as never woman sobbed before. And there is little Barbara, poor little Barbara, so much thinner and so much paler, and yet so very pretty, trembling like a leaf and supporting herself against the wall. And there is Mrs. Garland, neater and nicer than ever, fainting away stone dead with nobody to help her. And there is Mr. Abel, violently blowing his nose and wanting to embrace everybody. And there is the single gentleman hovering round them all and constant to nothing for an instant. And there is that good, dear, thoughtful little Jacob, sitting all alone by himself on the bottom stair, with his hands on his knees like an old man, roaring fearfully without giving any trouble to anybody. And each and all of them are for the time clean out of their wits, and do jointly and severally commit all manner of follies. And even when the rest have in some measure come to themselves again, and can find words and smiles, Barbara, that soft-hearted, gentle, foolish little Barbara, is suddenly missed and found to be in a swoon by herself in the back parlor, from which swoon she falls into hysterics, and from which hysterics into a swoon again, and is, indeed, so bad that despite a mortal quantity of vinegar and cold water, she is hardly a bit better at last than she was at first. Then Kit's mother comes in and says, will he come and speak to her? And Kit says yes, and goes. And he says in a kind voice, Barbara. And Barbara's mother tells her that it's only Kit. And Barbara says, with her eyes closed all the time, oh, but is it him indeed? And Barbara's mother says, to be sure it is, my dear. There's nothing the matter now. And in further assurance that he's safe and sound, Kit speaks to her again. And then Barbara goes off into another fit of laughter, and then into another fit of crying. And then Barbara's mother and Kit's mother nod to each other and pretend to scold her, but only to bring her to herself the faster, bless you. And being experienced matrons and acute at perceiving the first dawning symptoms of recovery, they comfort Kit with the assurance that she'll do now, and so dismiss him to the place from whence he came. Well, in that place, which is the next room, there are decanters of wine, and all that sort of thing, set out as grand as if Kit and his friends were first-rate company. And there is little Jacob walking, as the popular phrase is, into a homemade plum cake, at a most surprising pace, and keeping his eye on the figs and oranges which are to follow, and making the best use of his time, you may believe. Kit no sooner comes in than that single gentleman, never was such a busy gentleman, charges all the glasses, bumpers, and drinks his health, and tells him he shall never want a friend while he lives. And so does Mr. Garland, and so does Mrs. Garland, and so does Mr. Abel. But even this honor and distinction is not all, for the single gentleman forthwith pulls out of his pocket a massive silver watch, going hard and right to half a second. And upon the back of this watch is engraved Kit's name, with flourishes all over. And in short, it is Kit's watch, bought expressly for him, and presented to him on the spot. You may rest assured that Mr. and Mrs. Garland can't help hinting about their present in store, and that Mr. Abel tells outright that he has his, and that Kit is the happiest of the happy. There is one friend he has not seen yet, and as he cannot be conveniently introduced into the family circle, by reason of his being an iron-shod quadruped, Kit takes the first opportunity of slipping away and hurrying to the stable. The moment he lays his hand upon the latch, the pony neighs the loudest pony's greeting. Before he has crossed the threshold, the pony is capering about his loose box, for he brooks not the indignity of a halter, mad to give him welcome. And when Kit goes up to caress and pat him, the pony rubs his nose against his coat and fondles him more lovingly than ever pony fondled man. It is the crowning circumstance of his earnest, heartfelt reception, and Kit fairly puts his arm round Whisker's neck and hugs him. But how comes Barbara to trip in there? And how smart she is again. She has been at her glass since she recovered. How comes Barbara in the stable, of all places in the world? Why, since Kit has been away, the pony would take his food from nobody but her and Barbara. You see, not dreaming that Christopher was there, and just looking in, to see that everything was right, has come upon him unawares. Blushing little Barbara. It may be that Kit has caressed the pony enough. It may be that there are even better things to caress than ponies. He leaves him for Barbara at any rate, and hopes she is better. Yes, Barbara is a great deal better. She is afraid, and here Barbara looks down and blushes more, that he must have thought her very foolish. Not at all, says Kit. Barbara is glad of that and coughs. Him. Just the slightest cough possible, not more than that. What a discreet pony when he chooses. He is as quiet now as if he were of marble. He has a very knowing look, but that he always has. We have hardly had time to shake hands, Barbara, says Kit. Barbara gives him hers. Why, she is trembling now. Foolish, fluttering Barbara. Arm's length? The length of an arm is not much. Barbara's was not a long arm, by any means, and besides, she didn't hold it out straight, but bent a little. Kit was so near her when they shook hands that he could see a small, tiny tear, yet trembling on an eyelash. It was natural that he should look at it, unknown to Barbara. It was natural that Barbara should raise her eyes unconsciously and find him out. Was it natural that at that instant, without any previous impulse or design, Kit should kiss Barbara? He did it, whether or no. Barbara said for shame. But let him do it too twice. He might have done it thrice, but the pony kicked up his heels and shook his head, as if he were suddenly taken with convulsions of delight, and Barbara, being frightened, ran away, not straight to where her mother and Kit's mother were, though, lest they should see how red her cheeks were, and should ask her why. Sly little Barbara. When the first transports of the whole party had subsided, and Kit and his mother, and Barbara and her mother, with little Jacob and the baby to boot, had had their suppers together, which there was no hurrying over, for they were going to stop there all night, Mr. Garland called Kit to him, and taking him into a room where they could be alone, told him that he had something yet to say, which would surprise him greatly. Kit looked so anxious and turned so pale on hearing this, that the old gentleman hastened to add he would be agreeably surprised, and asked him if he would be ready next morning for a journey. "For a journey, sir," cried Kit, "in company with me and my friend in the next room. Can you guess its purpose?" Kit turned paler yet, and shook his head. "Oh yes, I think you do already," said his master. "Try." Kit murmured something rather rambling and unintelligible, but he plainly pronounced the words Miss Nell 3 or 4 times, shaking his head while he did so, as if he would add that there was no hope of that. But Mr. Garland, instead of saying try again, as Kit had made sure he would, told him very seriously that he had guessed right. "The place of their retreat is indeed discovered," he said, at last, "and that is our journey's end." Kit faltered out such questions as, where was it, and how had it been found, and how long since, and was she well and happy? "Happy she is, beyond all doubt," said Mr. Garland. "And well, I trust she will be soon. She has been weak and ailing, as I learn, but she was better when I heard this morning, and they were full of hope. Sit you down, and you shall hear the rest." Scarcely venturing to draw his breath, Kit did as he was told. Mr. Garland then related to him how he had a brother, of whom he would remember to have heard him speak, and whose picture, taken when he was a young man, hung in the best room, and how this brother lived a long way off in a country place with an old clergyman who had been his early friend. How, although they loved each other as brothers should, they had not met for many years, but had communicated by letter from time to time, always looking forward to some period when they would take each other by the hand once more, and still letting the present time steal on, as it was the habit for men to do, and suffering the future to melt into the past. How this brother, whose temper was very mild and quiet and retiring, such as Mr. Abel's, was greatly beloved by the simple people among whom he dwelt, who quite revered the bachelor, for so they called him, and had everyone experienced his charity and benevolence. How even those slight circumstances had come to his knowledge, very slowly and in course of years, for the bachelor was one of those whose goodness shuns the light, and who have more pleasure in discovering and extolling the good deeds of others than in trumpeting their own, be they never so commendable. How, for that reason, he seldom told them of his village friends. But how, for all that, his mind had become so full of two among them, a child and an old man, to whom he had been very kind, that, in a letter received a few days before, he had dwelt upon them from first to last, and had told such a tale of their wandering and mutual love that few could read it without being moved to tears. How he, the recipient of that letter, was directly led to the belief that these must be the very wanderers for whom so much search had been made, and whom heaven had directed to his brother's care. How he had written for such further information as would put the fact beyond all doubt. How it had that morning arrived, had confirmed his first impression into a certainty, and was the immediate cause of that journey being planned, which they were to take tomorrow. In the meantime, said the old gentleman rising, and laying his hand on Kit's shoulder, you have a great need of rest, for such a day as this would wear out the strongest man. Good night, and heaven send our journey may have a prosperous ending. Chapter 69. Kit was no sluggard next morning, but, springing from his bed some time before day, began to prepare for his welcome expedition. The hurry of spirits consequent upon the events of yesterday, and the unexpected intelligence he had heard at night, had troubled his sleep through the long dark hours, and summoned such uneasy dreams about his pillow that it was best to rise. But, had it been the beginning of some great labor with the same end in view, had it been the commencement of a long journey, to be performed on foot in that inclement season of the year, to be pursued under very privation and difficulty, and to be achieved only with great distress, fatigue, and suffering, had it been the dawn of some painful enterprise, certain to task his utmost powers of resolution and endurance, and to need his utmost fortitude, but only likely to end, if happily achieved, in good fortune and delight to Nell, Kit's cheerful zeal would have been as highly roused. Kit's ardor and impatience would have been, at least, the same. Nor was he alone excited and eager. Before he had been up a quarter of an hour, the whole house were astir and busy. Everybody hurried to do something towards facilitating the preparations. The single gentleman, it is true, could do nothing himself, but he overlooked everybody else and was more locomotive than anybody. The work of packing and making ready went briskly on, and by daybreak every preparation for the journey was completed. Then Kit began to wish they had not been quite so nimble, for the traveling carriage which had been hired for the occasion was not to arrive until 9 o'clock, and there was nothing but breakfast to fill up the intervening blank of 1 hour and a half. Yes, there was, though. There was Barbara. Barbara was busy, to be sure, but so much the better. Kit could help her, and that would pass away the time better than any means that could be devised. Barbara had no objection to this arrangement, and Kit, tracking out the idea which had come upon him so suddenly overnight, began to think that surely Barbara was fond of him, and surely he was fond of Barbara. Now Barbara, if the truth must be told, as it must and ought to be, Barbara seemed, of all the little household, to take least pleasure in the bustle of the occasion. And when Kit, in the openness of his heart, told her how glad and overjoyed it made him, Barbara became more downcast still, and seemed to have even less pleasure in it than before. "You have not been home so long, Christopher," said Barbara, and it is impossible to tell how carelessly she said it. "You have not been home so long that you need to be glad to go away again, I should think." "But for such a purpose," returned Kit, "to bring back Miss Nell, to see her again. Only think of that. I am so pleased, too, to think that you will see her, Barbara, at last." Barbara did not absolutely say that she felt no gratification on this point, but she expressed the sentiment so plainly by one little toss of her head that Kit was quite disconcerted and wondered, in his simplicity, why she was so cool about it. "You'll say she has the sweetest and beautifulest face you ever saw, I know," said Kit, rubbing his hands. "I'm sure you'll say that." Barbara tossed her head again. "What's the matter, Barbara?" said Kit. "Nothing," cried Barbara, and Barbara pouted. Not sulkily or in an ugly manner, but just enough to make her look more cherry-lipped than ever. There is no school in which a pupil gets on so fast as that in which Kit became a scholar when he gave Barbara the kiss. He saw what Barbara meant now. He had his lesson by heart all at once. She was the book. There it was before him, as plain as print. "Barbara," said Kit, "you're not cross with me?" "Oh dear no. Why should Barbara be cross? And what right had she to be cross? And what did it matter whether she was cross or not? Who minded her?" "Why, I do," said Kit. "Of course I do." Barbara didn't see why it was of course at all. Kit was sure she must. Would she think again? Certainly, Barbara would think again. No, she didn't see why it was of course. She didn't understand what Christopher meant. And besides, she was sure they wanted her upstairs by this time, and she must go, indeed. "No, but Barbara," said Kit, detaining her gently, "let us part friends. I was always thinking of you, in my troubles. I should have been a great deal more miserable than I was, if it hadn't been for you." Goodness gracious, how pretty Barbara was when she colored, and when she trembled, like a little shrinking bird. "I am telling you the truth, Barbara, upon my word, but not half so strong as I could wish," said Kit. "When I want you to be pleased to see Miss Nell, it's only because I like you to be pleased with what pleases me, that's all. As to her, Barbara, I think I could almost die to do her service, but you would think so too, if you knew her as I do. I am sure you would." Barbara was touched, and sorry to have appeared indifferent. "I have been used, you see," said Kit, "to talk and think of her, almost as if she was an angel. When I look forward to meeting her again, I think of her smiling as she used to do, and being glad to see me, and putting out her hand and saying, 'It's my own old Kit,' or some such words as those, like what she used to say. I think of seeing her happy, and with friends about her, and brought up as she deserves, and as she ought to be. When I think of myself, it's as her old servant, and one that loved her dearly, as his kind, good, gentle mistress, and who would have gone, yes, and still would go, through any harm to serve her. Once, I couldn't help being afraid that if she came back with friends about her she might forget, or be ashamed of having known, a humble lad like me, and so might speak coldly, which would have cut me, Barbara, deeper than I can tell. But when I came to think again, I felt sure that I was doing her wrong in this, and so I went on, as I did at first, hoping to see her once more, just as she used to be. Hoping this, and remembering what she was, has made me feel as if I would always try to please her, and always be what I should like to seem to her if I was still her servant. If I'm the better for that, and I don't think I'm the worse, I am grateful to her for it, and love and honor her the more. That's the plain, honest truth, dear Barbara, upon my word it is." Little Barbara was not of a wayward or capricious nature, and, being full of remorse, melted into tears. To what more conversation this might have led, we need not stop to inquire. For the wheels of the carriage were heard at that moment, and, being followed by a smart ring at the garden gate, caused the bustle in the house, which had laid dormant for a short time, to burst again into tenfold life and vigor. Simultaneously with the traveling equipage, arrived Mr. Chuckster in a hackney cab, with certain papers and supplies of money for the single gentleman, into whose hands he delivered them. This duty discharged, he subsided into the bosom of the family, and, entertaining himself with the strolling or peripatetic breakfast, watched, with genteel indifference, the process of loading the carriage. "Snobbish in this, I see, sir," he said to Mr. Abel Garland. "I thought he wasn't in the last trip, because it was expected that his presence wouldn't be acceptable to the ancient buffalo." "To whom, sir?" demanded Mr. Abel. "To the old gentleman," returned Mr. Chuckster, slightly abashed. "Our client prefers to take him now," said Mr. Abel, drily. "There is no longer any need for that precaution, as my father's relationship to a gentleman in whom the objects of his search have full confidence will be a sufficient guarantee for the friendly nature of their errand. Ah, thought Mr. Chuckster, looking out of window. Anybody but me. Snobby before me, of course. He didn't happen to take that particular 5-pound note, but I have not the smallest doubt that he's always up to something of that sort. I always said it, long before this came out. Devilish pretty girl that. 'Pon my soul, an amazing little creature. Barbara was the subject of Mr. Chuckster's commendations, and as she was lingering near the carriage, all being now ready for its departure, that gentleman was suddenly seized with a strong interest in the proceedings, which impelled him to swagger down the garden and take up his position at a convenient ogling distance. Having had great experience of the sex, and being perfectly acquainted with all those little artifices which find the readiest road to their hearts, Mr. Chuckster, on taking his ground, planted one hand on his hip, and with the other adjusted his flowing hair. This is a favorite attitude in the polite circles, and, accompanied with a graceful whistling, has been known to do immense execution. Such, however, is the difference between town and country, that nobody took the smallest notice of this insinuating figure. The wretches being wholly engaged in bidding the travelers farewell, in kissing hands to each other, waving handkerchiefs, and the like tame and vulgar practices. For now the single gentleman and Mr. Garland were in the carriage, and the postboy was in the saddle, and Kit, well wrapped and muffled up, was in the rumble behind. And Mrs. Garland was there, and Mr. Abel was there, and Kit's mother was there, and little Jacob was there, and Barbara's mother was visible in remote perspective, nursing the ever-wakeful baby, and all were nodding, beckoning, curtsying, or crying out, "Goodbye," with all the energy they could express. In another minute, the carriage was out of sight, and Mr. Chuckster remained alone on the spot where it had lately been, with a vision of Kit standing up in the rumble waving his hand to Barbara, and of Barbara in the full light and luster of his eyes. His eyes? Chuckster's? Chuckster the successful, on whom ladies of quality had looked with favor from phaetons in the parks on Sundays, waving hers to Kit. How Mr. Chuckster, entranced by this monstrous fact, stood for some time rooted to the earth, protesting within himself that Kit was the prince of felonious characters and very emperor or great mogul of snobs, and how he clearly traced this revolting circumstance back to that old villainy of the shilling, are matters foreign to our purpose, which is to track the rolling wheels and bear the travelers company on their cold, bleak journey. It was a bitter day. A keen wind was blowing and rushed against them fiercely, bleaching the hard ground, shaking the white frost from the trees and hedges, and whirling it away like dust. But little cared Kit for weather. There was a freedom and freshness in the wind, as it came howling by, which, let it cut never so sharp, was welcome. As it swept on with its cloud of frost, bearing down the dry twigs and boughs and withered leaves, and carrying them away pell-mell, it seemed as though some general sympathy had got abroad, and everything was in a hurry, like themselves. The harder the gusts, the better progress they appeared to make. It was a good thing to go struggling and fighting forward, vanquishing them one by one, to watch them driving up, gathering strength and fury as they came along, to bend for a moment as they whistled past, and then to look back and see them speed away, their hoarse noise dying in the distance, and the stout trees cowering down before them. All day long, it blew without cessation. The night was clear and starlit, but the wind had not fallen, and the cold was piercing. Sometimes, towards the end of a long stage, Kit could not help wishing it were a little warmer, but when they stopped to change horses, and he had had a good run, and what with that, and the bustle of paying the old postilion, and rousing the new one, and running to and fro again until the horses were put to, he was so warm that the blood tingled and smarted in his fingers' ends. Then he felt as if to have it 1 degree less cold would be to lose half the delight and glory of the journey, and up. He jumped again, right cheerily, singing to the merry music of the wheels as they rolled away, and, leaving the townspeople in their warm beds, pursued their course along the lonely road. Meantime the two gentlemen inside, who were little disposed to sleep, beguiled the time with conversation. As both were anxious and expectant, it naturally turned upon the subject of their expedition, on the manner in which it had been brought about, and on the hopes and fears they entertained respecting it. Of the former they had many, of the latter few. None perhaps beyond that indefinable uneasiness which is inseparable from suddenly awakened hope and protracted expectation. In one of the pauses of their discourse, and when half the night had worn away, the single gentleman, who had gradually become more and more silent and thoughtful, turned to his companion and said abruptly, "Are you a good listener?" "Like most other men, I suppose," returned Mr. Garland, smiling. "I can be, if I am interested, and if not interested, I should still try to appear so. Why do you ask?" "I have a short narrative on my lips," rejoined his friend, "and will try you with it. It is very brief." Pausing for no reply, he laid his hand on the old gentleman's sleeve and proceeded thus. "There were once two brothers who loved each other dearly. There was a disparity in their ages, some 12 years. I am not sure, but they may insensibly have loved each other the better for that reason. Wide as the interval between them was, however, they became rivals too soon. The deepest and strongest affection of both their hearts settled upon one object. The youngest, there were reasons for his being sensitive and watchful, was the first to find this out. I will not tell you what misery he underwent, what agony of soul he knew, how great his mental struggle was. He had been a sickly child. His brother, patient and considerate in the midst of his own high health and strength, had many and many a day denied himself the sports he loved, to sit beside his couch, telling him old stories till his pale face lighted up with an unwonted glow, to carry him in his arms to some green spot where he could tend the poor pensive boy as he looked upon the bright summer day and saw all nature healthy but himself, to be, in any way, his fond and faithful nurse. I may not dwell on all he did to make the poor, weak creature love him, or my tale would have no end. But when the time of trial came, the younger brother's heart was full of those old days. Heaven strengthened it to repay the sacrifices of inconsiderate youth by one of thoughtful manhood. He left his brother to be happy. The truth never passed his lips, and he quitted the country, hoping to die abroad. The elder brother married her. She was in heaven before long, and left him with an infant daughter. If you have seen the picture gallery of any one old family, you will remember how the same face and figure, often the fairest and slightest of them all, come upon you in different generations, and how you trace the same sweet girl through a long line of portraits, never growing old or changing, the good angel of the race, abiding by them in all reverses, redeeming all their sins. In this daughter the mother lived again. You may judge with what devotion he who lost that mother almost in the winning, clung to this girl, her breathing image. She grew to womanhood, and gave her heart to one who could not know its worth. Well, her fond father could not see her pine and droop. He might be more deserving than he thought him. He surely might become so with a wife like her. He joined their hands, and they were married. Through all the misery that followed this union, through all the cold neglect and undeserved reproach, through all the poverty he brought upon her, through all the struggles of their daily life, too mean and pitiful to tell, but dreadful to endure, she toiled on, in the deep devotion of her spirit and in her better nature, as only women can. Her means and substance wasted, her father nearly beggared by her husband's hand, and the hourly witness, for they lived now under one roof, of her ill usage and unhappiness. She never, but for him, bewailed her fate. Patient and upheld by strong affection to the last, she died a widow of some 3 weeks' date, leaving to her father's care 2 orphans, one a son of 10 or 12 years old, the other a girl, such another infant child, the same in helplessness, in age, in form, in feature, as she had been herself when her young mother died. The elder brother, grandfather to these 2 children, was now a broken man, crushed and borne down, less by the weight of years than by the heavy hand of sorrow. With the wreck of his possessions, he began to trade, in pictures first, and then in curious ancient things. He had entertained a fondness for such matters from a boy, and the tastes he had cultivated were now to yield him an anxious and precarious subsistence. The boy grew like his father in mind and person, the girl so like her mother, that when the old man had her on his knee and looked into her mild blue eyes, he felt as if awakening from a wretched dream, and his daughter were a little child again. The wayward boy soon spurned the shelter of his roof and sought associates more congenial to his taste. The old man and the child dwelt alone together. It was then, when the love of two dead people who had been nearest and dearest to his heart was all transferred to this slight creature, when her face, constantly before him, reminded him, from hour to hour, of the too early change he had seen in such another, of all the sufferings he had watched and known, and all his child had undergone. When the young man's profligate and hardened course drained him of money as his father's had, and even sometimes occasioned them temporary privation and distress, it was then that there began to beset him, and to be ever in his mind, a gloomy dread of poverty and want. He had no thought for himself in this. His fear was for the child. It was a specter in his house, and haunted him night and day. The younger brother had been a traveler in many countries, and had made his pilgrimage through life alone. His voluntary banishment had been misconstrued, and he had borne, not without pain, reproach and slight for doing that which had wrung his heart and cast a mournful shadow on his path. Apart from this, communication between him and the elder was difficult and uncertain and often failed. Still, it was not so wholly broken off but that he learnt, with long blanks and gaps between each interval of information, all that I have told you now. Then, dreams of their young, happy life, happy to him though laden with pain and early care, visited his pillow yet oftener than before, and every night, a boy again, he was at his brother's side. With the utmost speed he could exert, he settled his affairs, converted into money all the goods he had, and with honorable wealth enough for both, with open heart and hand, with limbs that trembled as they bore him on, with emotions such as men can hardly bear and live, arrived one evening at his brother's door. The narrator, whose voice had faltered lately, stopped. "The rest," said Mr. Garland, pressing his hand after a pause, "I know." "Yes," rejoined his friend, "we may spare ourselves the sequel. You know the poor result of all my search. Even when by dint of such inquiries as the utmost vigilance and sagacity could set on foot, we found they had been seen with two poor traveling showmen, and in time discovered the men themselves, and in time, the actual place of their retreat. Even then, we were too late. Pray God, we are not too late again." "We cannot be," said Mr. Garland. "This time we must succeed." "I have believed and hoped so," returned the other. "I try to believe and hope so still, but a heavy weight has fallen on my spirits, my good friend, and the sadness that gathers over me will yield to neither hope nor reason." "That does not surprise me," said Mr. Garland. "It is a natural consequence of the events you have recalled, of this dreary time and place, and above all of this wild and dismal night." "A dismal night indeed. Hark, how the wind is howling." Chapter 70. Day broke, and found them still upon their way. Since leaving home, they had halted here and there for necessary refreshment, and had frequently been delayed, especially in the night time, by waiting for fresh horses. They had made no other stoppages, but the weather continued rough, and the roads were often steep and heavy. It would be night again before they reached their place of destination. Kit, all bluff and hardened with the cold, went on manfully, and, having enough to do to keep his blood circulating, to picture to himself the happy end of this adventurous journey, and to look about him and be amazed at everything, had little spare time for thinking of discomforts. Though his impatience, and that of his fellow travelers, rapidly increased as the day waned, the hours did not stand still. The short daylight of winter soon faded away, and it was dark again when they had yet many miles to travel. As it grew dusk, the wind fell. Its distant moanings were more low and mournful, and, as it came creeping up the road, and rattling covertly among the dry brambles on either hand. It seemed like some great phantom for whom the way was narrow, whose garments rustled as it stalked along. By degrees it lulled and died away, and then it came on to snow. The flakes fell fast and thick, soon covering the ground some inches deep and spreading abroad a solemn stillness. The rolling wheels were noiseless, and the sharp ring and clatter of the horses' hoofs became a dull, muffled tramp. The life of their progress seemed to be slowly hushed, and something deathlike to usurp its place. Shading his eyes from the falling snow, which froze upon their lashes and obscured his sight, Kit often tried to catch the earliest glimpse of twinkling lights, denoting their approach to some not distant town. He could descry objects enough at such times, but none correctly. Now, a tall church spire appeared in view, which presently became a tree, a barn, a shadow on the ground, thrown on it by their own bright lamps. Now, there were horsemen, foot passengers, carriages, going on before, or meeting them in narrow ways, which, when they were close upon them, turned to shadows too. A wall, a ruin, a sturdy gable end, would rise up in the road, and, when they were plunging headlong at it, would be the road itself. Strange turnings too, bridges, and sheets of water, appeared to start up here and there, making the way doubtful and uncertain. And yet they were on the same bare road, and these things, like the others, as they were passed, turned into dim illusions. He descended slowly from his seat, for his limbs were numbed. When they arrived at a lone posting-house and inquired how far they had to go to reach their journey's end, it was a late hour in such by-places, and the people were abed. But a voice answered from an upper window, 10 miles. The 10 minutes that ensued appeared an hour, but at the end of that time, a shivering figure led out the horses they required, and after another brief delay they were again in motion. It was a cross-country road, full, after the first 3 or 4 miles, of holes and cart ruts, which, being covered by the snow, were so many pitfalls to the trembling horses and obliged them to keep a foot-pace. As it was next to impossible for men so much agitated as they were by this time, to sit still and move so slowly, all three got out and plodded on behind the carriage. The distance seemed interminable, and the walk was most laborious. As each was thinking within himself that the driver must have lost his way, a church bell, close at hand, struck the hour of midnight, and the carriage stopped. It had moved softly enough, but when it ceased to crunch the snow, the silence was as startling as if some great noise had been replaced by perfect stillness. "This is the place, gentlemen," said the driver, dismounting from his horse and knocking at the door of a little inn. "Hello. Past 12 o'clock is the dead of night here." The knocking was loud and long, but it failed to rouse the drowsy inmates. All continued dark and silent as before. They fell back a little and looked up at the windows, which were mere black patches in the whitened house front. No light appeared. The house might have been deserted, or the sleepers dead, for any air of life it had about it. They spoke together with a strange inconsistency, in whispers, unwilling to disturb again the dreary echoes they had just now raised. "Let us go on," said the younger brother, "and leave this good fellow to wake them if he can. I cannot rest until I know that we are not too late. Let us go on, in the name of heaven." They did so, leaving the postilion to order such accommodation as the house afforded, and to renew his knocking. Kit accompanied them with a little bundle, which he had hung in the carriage when they left home, and had not forgotten since, the bird in his old cage, just as she had left him. She would be glad to see her bird, he knew. The road wound gently downward. As they proceeded, they lost sight of the church whose clock they had heard, and of the small village clustering round it. The knocking, which was now renewed, and which in that stillness they could plainly hear, troubled them. They wished the man would forbear, or that they had told him not to break the silence until they returned. The old church tower, clad in a ghostly garb of pure cold white, again rose up before them, and a few moments brought them close beside it. A venerable building, gray, even in the midst of the hoary landscape. An ancient sundial on the belfry wall was nearly hidden by the snowdrift, and scarcely to be known for what it was. Time itself seemed to have grown dull and old, as if no day were ever to displace the melancholy night. A wicket gate was close at hand, but there was more than one path across the churchyard to which it led, and, uncertain which to take, they came to a stand again. The village street, if street that could be called, which was an irregular cluster of poor cottages of many heights and ages, some with their fronts, some with their backs, and some with gable ends towards the road, with here and there a signpost, or a shed encroaching on the path, was close at hand. There was a faint light in a chamber window not far off, and Kit ran towards that house to ask their way. His first shout was answered by an old man within, who presently appeared at the casement, wrapping some garment round his throat as a protection from the cold, and demanded who was abroad at that unseasonable hour, wanting him. "'Tis hard weather this," he grumbled, "and not a night to call me up in. My trade is not of that kind that I need be roused from bed. The business on which folks want me will keep cold, especially at this season. What do you want?" "I would not have roused you, if I had known you were old and ill," said Kit. "Old?" repeated the other peevishly. "How do you know I am old?" "Not so old as you think, friend, perhaps. As to being ill, you will find many young people in worse case than I am. More's the pity that it should be so. Not that I should be strong and hearty for my years, I mean, but that they should be weak and tender. I ask your pardon, though," said the old man, "if I spoke rather rough at first. My eyes are not good at night. That's neither age nor illness. They never were, and I didn't see you were a stranger." "I am sorry to call you from your bed," said Kit, "but those gentlemen you may see by the churchyard gate are strangers too, who have just arrived from a long journey and seek the parsonage house. You can direct us?" "I should be able to," answered the old man, in a trembling voice, "for, come next summer, I have been sexton here good 50 years. The right-hand path, friend, is the road. There is no ill news for our good gentleman, I hope?" Kit thanked him, and made him a hasty answer in the negative. He was turning back, when his attention was caught by the voice of a child. Looking up, he saw a very little creature at a neighboring window. "What is that?" cried the child, earnestly. "Has my dream come true? Pray speak to me, whoever that is, awake and up." "Poor boy," said the sexton, before Kit could answer. "How goes it, darling?" "Has my dream come true?" exclaimed the child again, in a voice so fervent that it might have thrilled to the heart of any listener. "But no, that can never be. How could it be? Oh, how could it?" "I guess his meaning," said the sexton. "To bed again, poor boy." "I?" cried the child, in a burst of despair. "I knew it could never be. I felt too sure of that before I asked. But all tonight and last night too, it was the same. I never fall asleep, but that cruel dream comes back." "Try to sleep again," said the old man, soothingly. "It will go in time." "No, no, I would rather that it stayed. Cruel as it is, I would rather that it stayed," rejoined the child. "I am not afraid to have it in my sleep, but I am so sad, so very, very sad." The old man blessed him. The child in tears replied good night, and Kit was again alone. He hurried back, moved by what he had heard, though more by the child's manner than by anything he had said, as his meaning was hidden from him. They took the path indicated by the sexton, and soon arrived before the parsonage wall. Turning round to look about them when they had got thus far, they saw, among some ruined buildings at a distance, one single solitary light. It shone from what appeared to be an old oriel window, and being surrounded by the deep shadows of overhanging walls, sparkled like a star. Bright and glimmering as the stars above their heads, lonely and motionless as they, it seemed to claim some kindred with the eternal lamps of heaven, and to burn in fellowship with them. "What light is that?" said the younger brother. "It is surely," said Mr. Garland, "in the ruin where they live. I see no other ruin hereabouts." "They cannot," returned the brother hastily. "Be waking at this late hour." Kit interposed directly and begged that, while they rang and waited at the gate, they would let him make his way to where this light was shining and try to ascertain if any people were about. Obtaining the permission he desired, he darted off with breathless eagerness and, still carrying the birdcage in his hand, made straight towards the spot. It was not easy to hold that pace among the graves, and at another time he might have gone more slowly or round by the path. Unmindful of all obstacles, however, he pressed forward without slackening his speed, and soon arrived within a few yards of the window. He approached as softly as he could, and advancing so near the wall as to brush the whitened ivy with his dress, listened. There was no sound inside. The church itself was not more quiet. Touching the glass with his cheek, he listened again. No, and yet there was such a silence all around that he felt sure he could have heard even the breathing of a sleeper if there had been one there. A strange circumstance, a light in such a place at that time of night, with no one near it. A curtain was drawn across the lower portion of the window, and he could not see into the room. But there was no shadow thrown upon it from within. To have gained a footing on the wall and tried to look in from above would have been attended with some danger, certainly with some noise, and the chance of terrifying the child, if that really were her habitation. Again and again he listened. Again and again the same wearisome blank. Leaving the spot with slow and cautious steps, and skirting the ruin for a few paces, he came at length to a door. He knocked. No answer. But there was a curious noise inside. It was difficult to determine what it was. It bore a resemblance to the low moaning of one in pain, but it was not that, being far too regular and constant. Now it seemed a kind of song, now a wail, seemed, that is, to his changing fancy, for the sound itself was never changed or checked. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, and in its tone there was something fearful, chilling, and unearthly. The listener's blood ran colder now than ever it had done in frost and snow, but he knocked again. There was no answer, and the sound went on without any interruption. He laid his hand softly upon the latch and put his knee against the door. It was secured on the inside, but yielded to the pressure and turned upon its hinges. He saw the glimmering of a fire upon the old walls and entered.